1937. Fall asleep to hilarious history, fiery disasters, and flexible laws. Written and narrated in the style of Mark Twain. This book is factually accurate and edited by a human. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The 9 Old Men and the Packing Case. By the time the year of our Lord 1937 pulled up its stool to the global tavern, humanity had reached a state of mind where it could look a catastrophe square in the eye and ask if it had brought any entertainment along with it. It was a year wherein the laws of physics, the boundaries of empires, and the patience of the Supreme Court were all stretched to their absolute limits. Man continued his ancient stumbling march toward progress, occasionally tripping over his own shoelaces and blaming the scenery. There is a peculiar affliction that strikes men who have been in power for any length of time. It is a sort of architectural fever. They begin to look at the foundations of the world, which were laid long before they were born, and which will likely persist long after they have been comfortably interred, and they decide that the whole thing would be much improved by moving the staircase to the other side of the room, or, better yet, replacing the floorboards entirely with their own brand of mahogany. Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was, by the early months of 1937, suffering from a severe case of this architectural fever. He had spent the previous few years acting as the chief contractor of the American experiment, furiously sketching blueprints for a New Deal that he hoped would rescue the citizenry from the doldrums of the Great Depression. He laid the foundation, he hung the shutters, and he painted the trim with all the zest of a man who believes he is constructing a cathedral when, in truth, he is merely trying to keep the house from falling down around his ears. But the blueprints were constantly being marked up in red ink by a group of gentlemen who held their offices in a building as grand and unyielding as the constitutions they purported to guard. These were the Supreme Court justices, the 9 Old Men, as they were affectionately and not so affectionately known. They were, to a man, keepers of the old clockwork, deeply suspicious of any newfangled gears that Mr. Roosevelt attempted to install in the mechanism of government. Whenever the president would roll out a piece of legislation designed to regulate, revitalize, or reform, the 9 Old Men would look at it through their monocles, sniff, and promptly toss it into the wastebasket, citing a rule or a precedent that seemed to date back to the invention of the wheel. Mr. Roosevelt, a man whose charm was matched only by his stubbornness, found this state of affairs to be intolerable. To him, the Supreme Court was not a pillar of justice. It was a roadblock. It was a group of obstinate fellows who believed that the law was a sacred relic to be preserved in amber, while he believed the law should be a pliable piece of clay, shaped daily to fit the contours of a changing world. He decided, in his wisdom, that the court needed a bit of fresh air, and by fresh air he meant a few new faces. The proposal he hatched was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, disguised as a matter of administrative efficiency. He suggested, with a smile that could likely sweeten a barrel of vinegar, that the court was simply too busy. The justices, he argued, were getting on in years. Some of them were quite ancient, possessing the combined age of a sequoia tree, and they needed assistance. His solution? To add a new seat to the bench for every justice who had reached the age of 70 and refused to retire. It was a clever bit of arithmetic. If the law didn't like his policies, he would simply create a new law that allowed him to add enough judges who did like his policies to effectively silence the ones who didn't. He called it judicial reform, but the rest of the country recognized it as the packing case. It was as if a man found himself losing at a game of poker, and rather than playing a better hand, he simply ordered the waiter to bring 4 extra chairs to the table and filled them with his own cousins. The public reaction was swift, and it was entirely missing the note of gratitude that Mr. Roosevelt had anticipated. He had assumed, perhaps erroneously, that because the people loved his voice on the radio, they would blindly endorse his manipulation of the judiciary. He failed to account for a fundamental quirk of the American character. While we may grumble about our institutions, and while we may complain that our leaders are incompetent, we have a deep, suspicious reverence for the old machinery. We like our traditions to be stubborn, even when they are annoying. The idea that the president, any president, could simply expand the court to suit his own whims sent a shiver of discomfort through the national spine. It felt, to the average citizen, like a man trying to rig the game of life. The newspapers howled, the pundits fumed, and the Senate, usually a place where spines were known to be made of gelatin, suddenly grew stiff. Mr. Roosevelt found himself in a position he did not particularly care for. He was being told no. It was a word he had not encountered with much frequency in the last 4 years. The country, it turned out, preferred their jurists elderly, stubborn, and completely independent of the executive branch. They would rather have a slow, dusty, inefficient Supreme Court that acted as a brake on the president's ambitions than a reformed, expanded court that acted as a rubber stamp for his desires. The lesson of early 1937 was a harsh one for the master of the White House. It demonstrated that in a democracy, the leader is never quite as free as he thinks he is. He may hold the pen, and he may draft the laws, and he may speak with the silver-tongued confidence of a man who owns the future, but he is always at every turn tethered to the cautious, trembling, and deeply conservative instincts of the people. Mr. Roosevelt, a man of great intelligence, eventually came to understand that you cannot simply pack a case full of new jurors and expect the public to applaud the trick. The 9 old men remained in their seats, the court remained at its size, and the Constitution remained for the time being unamended by presidential fiat. It was a grand, messy, and entirely human failure, and in the long run, it was perhaps the most democratic thing that could have happened. For if a leader is never checked, if he is never told to sit down and be quiet, he will eventually believe his own press releases, and that is a calamity from which no nation or no courtroom can easily recover. But for now, the machinery ground on, the gears clattered and clanked, and the 9 old men continued to look at the president's work with that same infuriatingly steady gaze, waiting to see what he would try to shove into the wastebasket next. Chapter 2. The Coronation of the Hesitant Brother. It is a curious thing, the lengths to which humanity will go to convince itself that a man is somehow different from his neighbor just because he has had a shiny, gilded circle of metal placed upon his head. We have spent centuries constructing elaborate cathedrals, composing somber music, and draping ourselves in velvets and ermines that weigh more than a mule's pack, all to create the illusion that the fellow in the chair is not merely a fellow at all, but something extracted from the heavens. London, in that spring of 1937, was positively feverish with this business. It was as if the city had decided that if it could only drape enough bunting and cheer loud enough, it might trick reality into holding its breath while the transformation occurred. The star of this particular show, if one can call the weight of an empire a show, was a man the world knew as Bertie, though the royal ledgers insisted on the more formal title of George VI. He was a man who, if he had been born to a grocer or a clerk, would likely have spent his days perfectly content to tend to his garden, read a book in a quiet corner, and perhaps complain mildly about the quality of his afternoon tea. He was a gentleman of modest appetites and a nervous disposition, a man who possessed a stutter that seemed to grow more pronounced the very moment he was required to speak for the benefit of a crowd. And yet, here he was. The universe, in its infinite and often cruel sense of humor, had reached down, plucked him from the quietude he so dearly craved, and shoved him onto the highest, most exposed platform on the planet. One must spare a moment's thought for the brother. Across the English Channel, at a comfortable distance from the pomp and the shouting, sat the other brother, the one who had held the crown for a heartbeat, only to decide that a certain lady of American origin was worth more than the whole bloody lot of it. He watched from the sidelines, presumably with a glass of something strong in his hand, observing the spectacle of his sibling inheriting the job he had found entirely too cumbersome to carry. It is a strange sort of theater, is it not? One man runs away from the burden as if it were a house on fire, and the other stands still, trembling, because he is told that duty is a suit of armor he cannot take off, even when it chafes. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of ancient, dusty pageantry. Westminster Abbey was packed to the rafters with the great and the good, all dressed in their finery, pretending that they were not merely a collection of aging aristocrats and politicians trying to look important in the shadow of history. There was the oil, there was the orb, there was the scepter, all the magical talismans that serve to remind the common man that he is a subject, and that the person sitting on the throne is, by divine decree, a master. One can only imagine what was going through the mind of the king as he sat there, feeling the weight of the crown settling onto his brow. It is a heavy thing, that crown, not just in pounds and ounces, but in the sheer crushing mass of expectation. The people want a god, you see. They want a figurehead who is unshakable, who is golden, who can speak with the eloquence of a prophet and the iron resolve of a warrior. They do not want a man who stammers. They do not want a man who gets the jitters when he looks out at a crowd. And yet the irony is that the man who stammers, the man who knows fear, is often the only one capable of understanding what the rest of us are feeling. The world in 1937 was a jittery place. The air was thick with the scent of impending storms, and the old empires were beginning to crack and crumble like dry biscuits. To place a nervous, hesitant man at the helm of the British Empire at such a moment seemed, to the detached observer, like a joke played by a cosmic comedian with a penchant for black humor. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the world didn't need a roar. Perhaps it needed someone who knew how to listen, even if the words came out slowly. Watching the proceedings, one could not help but be struck by the absurdity of the whole affair. The medieval rites, the ancient oaths, it was as if time had been folded back upon itself. We are creatures of habit, are we not? We build the future out of the scraps of the past, and we are terrified to let go of the old costumes, even when they no longer fit. The king went through the motions, a quiet man playing a loud part, his face a mask of solemn duty. He took the oath, he accepted the burdens, and in doing so, he signed away the remainder of his private life. There is a tragedy in it, of course, the tragedy of the man who is defined by his station rather than his soul. But there is also a sort of stubborn nobility to it. To be pushed into a role you never wanted, to be surrounded by wolves and sycophants, and the crushing weight of a fading empire, and to decide that you will show up every day and do your best to keep the ship upright. That is a harder thing than winning a battle or conquering a territory. It is the quiet daily heroism of the man who simply refuses to quit. The brother across the channel, the one who chose the heart over the crown, may have looked on and felt a sense of relief, or perhaps a twinge of guilt, or perhaps nothing at all, but the cold wind of exile. But for George, there was no choice. The cards had been dealt, and he had to play the hand. And so he sat on the throne, the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders, the murmurs of a fractured world rising up to meet him. As the ceremony concluded and the cheers erupted, echoing off the ancient stone walls, one wondered what the future would hold for this hesitant king. Would he be crushed by the weight of the crown, or would he find, in the crucible of his own anxiety, a strength that no one, least of all himself, ever expected him to possess? The world would soon find out. History has a way of testing a man's mettle when he least desires it, and for the man who only wanted a quiet garden, the storms were just beginning to gather on the horizon. The crown, shiny and bright as it was already starting to look a bit like a lightning rod. And the year 1937 was, as we shall see, a year that would demand exactly that sort of conductor. But for that moment, in the Abbey, amidst the incense and the organ music, it was all just a grand, gilded play. The curtain had risen, the lead actor was in his place, and the audience was waiting to see if he would stumble over his lines or find the courage to speak them true. In the long ledger of human affairs, it was but a footnote, yet in the life of one man, it was the entire book. He sat there, still and silent, and the empire, in its own restless way, held its breath and waited to see what kind of king this reluctant fellow would become. It is a grand, dizzying business, ruling the world. I, for one, would much rather be the man writing about it, for the writer gets to keep his own head, even if he loses his mind from time to time. Chapter 3. The Great Pedestrian Stampede. There is a peculiar kind of human madness that demands we build things solely for the purpose of standing on top of them, as if the ground beneath our feet were somehow insufficient for the business of existing. In the year of our Lord 1937, the fine citizens of San Francisco decided that their city, which was already quite handsomely situated on its hills, required a giant metallic zipper to pull the northern landscape closer to the southern. They called this zipper the Golden Gate Bridge. And while the name suggests a grand, glowing portal to the riches of the Orient, it was, in reality, a mile and a half of steel, rivets, and enough international orange paint to coat every barn in the state of Kansas. It is a curious thing, this business of bridge building. You take a vast, yawning chasm, or in this case, the swirling, treacherous throat of the Pacific, and you decide that the natural order of things, which dictates that you stay on your side and the fish stay on theirs, is merely a suggestion. The engineers, those men with slide rules for hearts and ink-stained fingers, drew up blueprints that looked like a spider had spun a web out of geometry and hubris. They calculated wind speeds and tension and the tensile strength of steel cables, and they declared that this, the largest suspension bridge in the world, would stand firm. But the engineers, for all their impressive capacity to measure the invisible, often forget to calculate the most volatile variable in the equation, the human being. On the 27th of May, 1937, before a single automobile was permitted to sully the pristine surface of the roadway with its oil and exhaust, the gates were opened to the public. It was designated as Pedestrian Day. One might have expected a polite, orderly stroll, perhaps a few pleasantries exchanged between neighbors, and a gentle admiration of the view from a few hundred feet above the churning tide. One might have expected, in short, a dignified parade. One would have been spectacularly wrong. It was not a stroll. It was a stampede. It was a mass migration of the curious, the bored, and the thrill-seeking, all possessed by the singular, inexplicable urge to prove that they could walk from one side of the world to the other without falling off. 200,000 people descended upon the bridge, pressing themselves against one another until the entire span looked less like a monument to engineering and more like a human carpet woven from felt hats, wool suits, and the collective anxiety of the city's fathers. Picture, if you will, the engineers standing at the edge, clutching their clipboards, their faces gone the color of a freshly plastered wall. They had spent years worrying about the structural integrity of the steel towers, the load-bearing capacity of the cables, and the way the bridge might sway in the gale-force winds. They had accounted for the weight of traffic, the weight of winter snows, and the weight of the occasional overly ambitious bird. But they had not accounted for the weight of 200,000 human bodies, all shuffling, jostling, and vibrating with the nervous energy of the modern age. It is a comical image, really. A bridge, built to be a titan of industry, groaning under the sheer unbridled weight of folks who simply wanted to be able to say they had been the first to cross the thing. It was a test of faith, not in the steel, but in the insanity of the species. As the sun climbed over the hills, the crowd surged forward. It was a sea of humanity, a slow-moving river of people that defied the orderly laws of traffic. There were men in bowler hats who looked as though they had walked out of an office and forgotten to stop. There were families with children in tow looking about with the wide-eyed wonder that only the very young and the very foolish possess. There were photographers jockeying for position, their cameras held aloft like talismans against the encroaching chaos. The bridge, to its credit, held. It stood there, long and defiant, suspended over the waters where the currents tear at the foundations of the earth. It flexed, it groaned, it shifted its weight in a way that made the heart of any man with a fear of heights, which is to say any man with a functioning brain, stop dead in his chest. But it held. It swallowed the multitude, digested their collective movement, and dared them to try and bring it down. What is it about us, I wonder, that drives us to create these impossible structures? Is it a desire to dominate the landscape, to put a stamp of ownership on the wild, unkempt corners of the globe, or is it something more primitive, a yearning to connect, a desperate, irrational need to shrink the world until it fits inside our pockets? We build bridges so we don't have to swim, and we build airplanes so we don't have to walk, and we build skyscrapers so we don't have to live near the dirt. We are a busy, restless, and deeply dissatisfied animal, constantly trying to escape the limitations of our own geography. The stampede that day was a miniature version of the entire decade. It was a moment of exuberance, a brief, breathless pause where we convinced ourselves that we had finally mastered the forces of nature, that we had pinned the earth down with steel spikes and paved over the chaos with concrete. We felt, for a few hours, as though we were invincible. We stood on the bridge, looked down at the fog swirling around the towers like a ghostly shroud, and we felt like gods. But as the day waned and the shadows grew long, the people retreated, leaving behind nothing but a sea of discarded candy wrappers and the echo of their own footsteps. The bridge remained silent and solitary once more, a monument to the fact that we had been there. It was a lonely object, really, a testament to human ingenuity, yes, but also a monument to our own fragile hubris. We had conquered the gap, but we had not conquered the distance between ourselves. The engineers eventually stopped shaking, the traffic began its relentless rhythmic drumming across the span, and the city went back to its business. The bridge became, as all things do, merely a fixture of the landscape. It stopped being a miracle and started being a commute. That is the way of the world. We build our wonders in a fever. We rush to test them in a frenzy, and then we grow bored of them as quickly as we can. But I suspect that if you go down to the shore on a quiet morning, when the fog is thick and the world is asleep, you might still hear the ghost of that stampede. You might hear the faint phantom sound of 200,000 footsteps, the collective heartbeat of a city that dared to defy the gravity of its own circumstances. It was a day when the people were the engine of the machine, and for a fleeting, beautiful, and utterly ridiculous moment, the world moved to the rhythm of our own restless feet. And that, I suppose, is worth a fair bit more than all the steel and concrete in the state of California combined. Chapter 4. The Art of the Stationary Strike. In the sprawling, smoky theater of the American industrial landscape, there is perhaps no city more earnest, more soot-stained, and more singularly obsessed with the manufacture of the rolling carriage than Flint, Michigan. It is a place where the sun seems to rise only to check if the assembly line is still running, and where the air possesses that distinct metallic tang of oil and ambition. In the winter of 1937, this city became the stage for a most peculiar experiment in human recalcitrance, a comedy of manners enacted by men in greasy overalls against the titans of the boardroom. The prevailing logic of the era, a logic cherished by the high priests of the corporation, was simple. A worker is a cog. He is a part of the machine, much like a piston or a spark plug, only he is significantly cheaper to replace and far more prone to complaining about his wages. If a man is dissatisfied with his lot, the rules of the game are quite clear. He is expected to walk out the front door, trudge into the snow, and hold a picket sign until he is either replaced by a more desperate fellow or until he decides that a hungry belly is, after all, a rather persuasive argument for returning to the grind. But the workers of Flint, having spent enough hours staring at the relentless ticking rhythm of the belt, had arrived at a conclusion that would have shocked the sensibilities of a Victorian moralist. They realize that if a man walks out of a factory, he has merely surrendered his position. He has made himself a stranger to the machinery. But if he stays, if he simply sits down upon the very product he is paid to assemble and refuses to budge, He becomes, quite suddenly, the most important man in the building. He is no longer a cog. He is a glitch in the software, an immovable object in the path of an irresistible profit margin. It was a master stroke of indolence turned into a weapon of war. The sit-down strike, as the newspapers dubbed it, was a performance of such quiet, devastating effectiveness that it left the captains of industry sputtering in their mahogany-paneled offices. They did not know what to do with a man who wasn't walking away. One can call the police to clear a picket line. One can threaten to fire a man who does not report for his shift. But how does one evict a man who is reclining on the half-finished seat of a Chevrolet, playing a game of Pinochle, and smiling at the foreman with the beatific calm of a man who has suddenly discovered the joys of a long, unplanned holiday? The factory, which had spent its existence vibrating with a cacophony of rivets and the screech of steel, suddenly fell into a hush. The silence was the most terrifying thing of all. A factory that is not producing is, to a manager, a dying animal. Every minute that the belt did not turn was a minute of lost gold, a hemorrhage of potential revenue that flowed out the doors and into the ether. And yet there sat the men, perfectly content, treating the factory floor like their own private sitting room. They brought their own blankets, they organized committees, they used the facilities, they even, in a fit of delightful absurdity, kept the cars clean. It was a strike that looked suspiciously like a slumber party, save for the fact that the stakes were the entire livelihood of the working class. The wives of the strikers, demonstrating a resourcefulness that puts most generals to shame, passed food through the factory windows, ensuring that their husbands were well fed enough to hold their positions for as long as the winter might require. The management, flustered and confused, tried the traditional methods of intimidation. They turned off the heat. The strikers simply donned their winter coats and hunkered down in the leather-upholstered comfort of the unfinished automobiles. They turned off the water. The strikers found other ways to maintain their dignity. It was a contest of wills between the men who thought they owned the world and the men who actually knew how to build it. There is a deep, abiding irony in the sight of a man sitting in a machine that he helped create, refusing to let it be sold until he is paid a fair share of its value. It brings to mind the old adage that possession is 9/10 of the law, and in Flint it seemed to be 10/10 of the strategy. The managers, accustomed to the predictable mechanical obedience of their employees, found themselves face to face with a human stubbornness that no slide rule could calculate. One cannot help but admire the sheer defiant humor of it. For years, the assembly line had demanded that these men move faster, reach further, and tighten bolts with the precision of a clock. Now, the men had turned the tables not by moving faster, but by refusing to move at all. They had discovered that inaction, when practiced on a grand enough scale, is the most active form of protest imaginable. The city, meanwhile, watched with bated breath. The world outside the factory walls was still spinning. The politicians were still politicking. The wars were still brewing, and the weather remained just as disagreeable as ever. But inside the plant, time had stood still. It was a stalemate of the highest order. The company wanted its cars, and the men wanted their rights. And between them lay the immense, silent void of the stopped line. What this revealed, to anyone with the sense to look, was that the machinery of civilization is not merely made of steel and rubber and internal combustion. It is made of the consent of the people who operate the levers. When that consent is withdrawn, when the hand that feeds the machine decides it would rather be doing something else, like sitting down, the entire cathedral of industry trembles. Eventually, the pressure mounted, the negotiations were held in smoky rooms, and the settlements were signed with fountain pens that cost more than a foreman's annual salary. But the damage, or perhaps the enlightenment, had been done. The sit-down strike had proven that a man does not need to march in the streets or shout slogans to change the world. He merely needs to sit where he is and refuse to let the world continue without him. It is a lesson that bears remembering, even in an age of automated wonders and digital ghosts. We are so often told that we must be productive, that we must be moving, that we must be contributing to the great humming engine of society. But there is a power in the pause. There is a sanctity in the sit-down. And every once in a while, it is the man who stays in his seat, with his arms folded and his heels dug into the linoleum, who truly steers the course of history. The Flint Sit-Down was not a riot. It was a revolution of manners. It was the spectacle of the common man discovering that the throne he sat upon was actually made of seat frames and steel, and that if he could hold on to that seat long enough, the world would eventually have to come to him and ask for permission to continue. And in 1937, that is precisely what happened. The factory began to hum again, but it hummed to a new tune, one that included, however begrudgingly, a note of respect for the man who had the courage to simply sit and wait for justice to catch up. Chapter 5. The Sudden Conflagration at Lakehurst. There is, in the nature of man, a sort of constitutional defect that compels him to build his castles not upon the rock, but in the sky, and preferably out of materials that are prone to combustion. We have always had this itch to be birds, though we lack the feathers, the hollow bones, and, quite frankly, the common sense. By the time 1937 rolled around, we had refined this avian ambition into the form of the zeppelin, a great lumbering silver-skinned leviathan that cruised above the clouds with all the grace of a floating hotel and all the structural security of a soap bubble filled with dynamite. The Hindenburg was the absolute pinnacle of this particular brand of aerial hubris. It was a marvel of the modern age, a cigar-shaped monument to the notion that if one is sufficiently polite and wears a dinner jacket, one can float across the Atlantic in defiance of the laws of gravity. It was a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly reckless machine. It promised the weary traveler a view of the world from the heavens, a luxury of travel that made the ocean liners seem like mere tub scrubbers and the trains like glorified earthworms. But there is a catch to such grandeur, as there always is when man tries to snatch a few miles per hour away from the Almighty. The Hindenburg was lifted by hydrogen. Now, for those who skipped their chemistry lessons in favor of skipping rocks across the creek, hydrogen is a gas that possesses two primary characteristics. It is exceptionally light, and it is exceptionally eager to turn into a firework. It is the most flammable substance in the heavens, yet we chose to fill a vessel the size of a city block with the stuff, wrap it in a thin skin of cotton, and fly it through thunderstorms. It is the sort of logic that would make a sensible goat pause and consider the consequences, yet for the passengers of the Hindenburg, it was just the price of a fancy ticket. One must marvel with a wry sort of grin at the interior of the beast. They had dining rooms, they had staterooms, and in a fit of absolute head-shaking insanity, they had a smoking room. Yes, a pressurized, sealed-off chamber where gentlemen could puff on their cigars and pipes, suspended thousands of feet in the air by a gas that would ignite if one looked at it with too much static electricity. It is the kind of irony that the Greeks would have built a tragedy around, but we simply called it service. On that fateful day in May at Lakehurst, New Jersey, the ship arrived at the end of its voyage, looking for all the world like a silver whale returning from the deep. The ground crew was waiting, the lines were being readied, and the passengers were likely dreaming of their luggage and the solid, unmoving ground of the American continent. The weather was disagreeable, as it so often is when one is tempting fate, and a thunderstorm had been throwing tantrums in the vicinity. But a schedule is a schedule, and the modern man believes that a timetable is a contract signed by the cosmos itself. And then, in the blink of an eye, or more precisely, in the span of 34 seconds, the dream turned to ash. A spark, a snap, a flick of the atmospheric finger, and the great silver sausage became a roaring, incandescent torch. There was no slow decline, no graceful surrender to gravity. It was a sudden, violent, and absolute transformation. In less time than it takes to recite a prayer or curse the weather, the pride of the German sky was reduced to a skeleton of twisted metal and a memory of smoke. It was a disaster so swift and so total that it left the witnesses on the ground standing with their mouths agape, unable to comprehend that the miracle they had been watching had ceased to exist. It is a grim, sobering thought, is it not? That all our clever engineering, all our pride, all our shiny metal and fabric can be undone by a bit of bad luck and a stray spark. The Hindenburg Disaster was the end of the age of airships, though we didn't know it at the time. It was the moment humanity looked up at its own creation and realized that we had, in our eagerness to master the air, forgotten to respect the fire. We are a strange species. We mourn the loss of the ship. We wring our hands over the tragedy, and we fill the newspapers with talk of safety and regulations. And yet, if you look closely, you will see that we haven't learned the lesson at all. We still build our great towers. We still launch our rockets. And we still convince ourselves that we have tamed the elements. We just trade one hazard for another. We swapped hydrogen for kerosene and canvas for aluminum, and we continue to strap ourselves into things that defy the natural order, hoping that this time the spark won't find us. The newsreels of the day captured the disaster in a way that words never could. They showed the ship dropping, the fire consuming the tail, the absolute helpless fall of a giant brought low by its own belly. It was the death of an illusion. The Hindenburg was meant to be the future of speed, of comfort, of international connection. Instead, it became a tombstone. It marked the spot where the romance of the airship ran headlong into the reality of physics. One cannot help but feel a strange, hollow sympathy for the victims. They were people who believed in the promise of the age, who stepped onto that craft with the naive belief that progress was a one-way street leading to a brighter, faster, better tomorrow. They didn't know that they were boarding a matchbox. They were just travelers, hoping to see the world from above, never suspecting that the world would be watching them burn in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. It makes one wonder what we're doing today in our own time that future generations will look back on with the same mixture of pity and bewilderment. What are the hydrogen ships of our current life? What are the dangers we ignore, the risks we brush aside because they are hidden behind a veneer of luxury and convenience? We are all, in some fashion, passengers on a ship that we believe is unsinkable, forgetting that the iceberg is always there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the ship to get comfortable enough to stop paying attention. The fire at Lakehurst was not just a tragedy of a machine, it was a tragedy of hubris. It was the moment the 20th century lost its innocence. We learned that the sky is not a plaything, and that nature, when provoked, does not negotiate. We can try to build our floating castles and our sky-high machines, but we remain, at our core, children playing with matches in a room filled with gas. So let the Hindenburg be a reminder. Let it be a warning from the past etched into the annals of history that man's capacity for technological brilliance is matched only by his capacity for ignoring the blindingly obvious. We can build wonders, yes, we can conquer distances, certainly, but we must never forget that for all our pride, we are still small, we are still fragile, and the universe, with its storms and its sparks, is still very much in charge. As for the smoking room on that doomed vessel, well, it remains the most perfect biting example of human folly I have ever encountered. To think that we went to all the trouble of making a ship that could fly, only to include a dedicated space for creating fire inside of it. If that doesn't define the spirit of 1937, nothing does. We build the most exquisite traps for ourselves and then act surprised when we get caught in them. It is a comedy, truly a dark, smoky, terrifying comedy. And the joke is always invariably on us. We keep on building, we keep on flying, and we keep on striking matches in the dark, praying to the heavens that this time, just this once, the air won't turn into a furnace. And that, I reckon, is the most human thing of all. Chapter 6. The Flight into the Great Blue Void. There is a particular brand of madness that overtakes a person who looks at the horizon and feels not a sense of comfort, but a sense of insult. Most of us, being sensible creatures with a healthy respect for our own mortality, look at the horizon and think, "That is far enough, thank you very much," and proceed to settle down for a nice long nap in a hammock. But there is another sort, a restless, itchy-souled sort, who looks at that same line where the earth meets the sky and thinks, "What is hiding behind that?" And then, inevitably, decides they simply must go and find out. Amelia Earhart was, by all accounts, one of these afflicted souls. She was a woman who had come to the conclusion that the surface of the earth was altogether too crowded with fences, rules, and tea parties, and that the only proper place for a person of spirit was in the company of the clouds. It is a noble ambition, in its own way, to want to be a bird, though birds have the distinct advantage of not needing to fuel their engines or navigate by radio beacons that are about as reliable as a drunken sailor on shore leave. In 1937, Amelia decided that she would circumnavigate the globe, a feat that, while impressive, strikes me as a rather complicated way of returning to the place you started. She took off in her Lockheed Electra, a shiny silver bird of metal and rivets that roared with the arrogance of the industrial age. She flew over oceans that were vast, blue, and remarkably indifferent to the plight of anyone who might happen to fall into them. She flew over jungles, deserts, and cities, treating the world like a map spread out on a table, waiting to be folded and tucked away in a trunk. But the Pacific Ocean, that grand, watery theater of the impossible, is not a map. It is not a sheet of paper. It is a living, breathing, heaving expanse of liquid arrogance. It is a place where space is measured not in miles, but in eternities. When you fly over the Pacific, you are not merely traveling. You are trespassing. You are a gnat buzzing across the back of a sleeping giant, and should the giant wake up or simply decide to twitch, you are, for all intents and purposes, part of the scenery. Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, flew out into that great blue void, chasing the sunset and a tiny speck of land called Howland Island. It is a speck so small that it is barely a footnote in the ledger of geography, a place that exists mostly to give the sea something to wash against. They were looking for it, and the world was watching, holding its breath with the collective anxiety of a schoolroom waiting for the teacher to reveal the answer to a riddle. Then came the silence. It is a terrifying thing. Silence. We are used to noise. The clatter of the city, the hum of the machine, the constant, insistent chatter of our own thoughts. But the silence that swallowed Amelia Earhart was of a different quality. It was a thick, heavy, absolute silence that spoke of nothing but the profound and crushing indifference of the universe. The radio signals, which had been frantic, became sporadic. They became whispers, and then they became nothing. The world reacted with a flurry of activity that can only be described as a frantic, well-intentioned absurdity. The American government, in a rare fit of concern for an individual, dispatched ships, planes, and rescue parties. They scoured the ocean as if they were looking for a lost key in a haystack. They scanned every wave, peered into every shadow, and listened to every crackle of static. It was a noble gesture, I suppose. It was the human way of saying, we refuse to believe that the world is that big, and we are that small. But the ocean, that ancient silent keeper of secrets, did not yield. It did not give up its prize. It swallowed the plane, the pilot, and the navigator, and it did so without a ripple of remorse. The search parties turned back, their ships empty, their hearts heavy, and their maps marked with the word unknown. It is here that the human imagination takes over, and frankly, it makes a terrible mess of the truth. Because we cannot bear to think of the silence, we fill it with stories. We make up tales of secret missions, of capture, of island castaways living out their days on a beach made of coral and dreams. We turn the disappearance into a myth, a mystery, a puzzle to be solved. We would rather have a puzzle than a tragedy, for a puzzle implies that there is an answer, whereas a tragedy merely implies that we are not as in control as we like to pretend. Amelia Earhart became, in the wake of her vanishing, a ghost. She became a symbol of everything we love, the bravery, the daring, the refusal to sit still, and everything we fear, the vastness, the cold, the finality of the dark. We keep looking for her, metaphorically speaking. We keep searching the waves of history, hoping to find a scrap of wing, a piece of fabric, a signal that tells us where she went. But I suspect that if we ever did find her, we would be disappointed. We don't want the truth. We want the mystery. We want to believe that there is a place beyond the horizon where the lost things go, a place where the rules of the world don't apply and where the spirit can fly forever, unencumbered by gravity or reality. We want to believe that the ocean didn't just swallow her, but that she slipped into another dimension, a place where the wind is always at your back and the fuel tanks never run dry. There is a lesson here, I suppose, if one has the stomach to look at it. It is that we are all, in our own way, flying into the great blue void. We have our little machines, our little plans, and our little ambitions, and we steer them into the unknown, hoping that we will find our own Howland Island, our own little patch of safety in the vast, swirling chaos of existence. Most of us find it, or at least we find enough of it to satisfy us. But every now and then, the ocean reaches up, the engine sputters, and the signal fades. Amelia Earhart did not fail because she was a bad pilot or a foolish adventurer. She failed because the world is a bigger, meaner, and more magnificent place than any of us can truly comprehend. She was a woman who reached for the stars and found only the sea. And while that is a tragic outcome, it is a magnificent way to go. She died doing the one thing that most of us are too terrified to even consider. She pushed the boundaries of her own existence until the world pushed back. So, let her stay where she is. Let her be the ghost of the Pacific, the silver bird that never landed. It is a far better fate than growing old in a rocking chair, staring at a wall and wondering what might have happened if you had only had the courage to turn the key and point the nose of your life toward the unknown. The sky is a terrible landlord, it is true, and the ocean is a heartless master, but they are the only ones who get to see the view from the top. And I reckon, for a person like Amelia, that was worth the price of the ticket. We keep looking for her, and in doing so, we look for ourselves. We look for the part of us that isn't satisfied with the dinner party, the part of us that wants to see what's on the other side of the sunset. It is a dangerous, foolish, and entirely human impulse, and thank heavens for it. Without that impulse, we would still be huddled in our caves, scared of the dark and afraid of the wind. We would have no bridges, no ships, and no stories. We would have no heroes, and we would have no ghosts. And so, the search goes on, not in the waters, but in our minds. We keep the memory of the flight alive, not because we want to solve the mystery, but because we need the mystery to remind us that the world is still big, still wild, and still waiting for someone to come along and try to tame it, even if they fail. The great blue void is waiting for us all in the end. It is patient, it is silent, and it has plenty of room for everyone. Amelia just got there a little ahead of the rest of us. Chapter 7. The Sky Raiders of Guernica. It has long been a hobby of the human race to find new and ingenious ways of ending a neighbor's lease on life. We began quite modestly with the cudgel and the stone, which had the distinct advantage of requiring one to look his opponent in the eye. That, at least, was an honest transaction. You knew who you were killing, and he knew who was doing the killing, and there was a sort of grim mutual acknowledgment in the matter. But as we grew civilized, we decided that looking at our work was bad for the digestion. We invented the arrow, the cannon, and the rifle, all designed to make the messy business of destruction take place at a comfortable, polite distance. By the year of our Lord 1937, we had achieved the pinnacle of this cowardly ambition. We had taken to the clouds. There is a village in Spain, tucked away in the Basque country, called Guernica. It was, until that fateful April, a place of no great geopolitical significance. It was not a fortress. It was not a munitions factory. It was a market town, where farmers came to swap potatoes for gossip and where the most dangerous weapon on display was likely a butcher's cleaver. It was a place that smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the quiet contentment of people who have the good sense to leave the rest of the world alone. But in the lexicon of the German Condor Legion, which had been dispatched to Spain to practice the art of bullying on behalf of a local dictator, Guernica was not a village. It was a target, or, to put it in the clinical, bloodless language of the modern military strategist, it was a laboratory. They arrived on a Monday, the very day when the village square was bustling with the trade of the week. The sky, which ought to have been the property of the larks and the clouds, was suddenly possessed by the droning of engines. These were not the gentle bird-like machines of our dreams, but iron-bellied vultures, piloted by men who had been told that they were not soldiers in a war, but technicians in a scientific trial. They were there to test the efficiency of a new industrialized way of murdering a town. It is a fascinating, if utterly repulsive thing, to consider the cold, calculated nature of it. They didn't come to win a battle. They came to see what would happen if you dropped enough explosives on a concentration of unsuspecting humanity. It was a study in physics, conducted with human lives as the variables. The pilots, flying high enough that they could not see the faces of the people they were turning to ash, released their payloads with the rhythmic, mechanical indifference of a clock striking the hour. The bombs fell, and the world, or at least the world of the village, ended. The chimney pots were shattered, the market stalls were turned into kindling, and the silence of the Basque afternoon was replaced by a cacophony of thunder that had no business being on the ground. They used incendiaries, those clever, hellish little devices that ensure that if the blast doesn't get you, the fire will certainly finish the job. It was a masterpiece of total destruction, a symphony of ruin played upon the rooftops of people who were merely trying to sell their cabbages. What makes this particular episode so profoundly maddening is not just the act itself, but the arrogance that accompanied it. The men who dropped those bombs did not view themselves as butchers. They viewed themselves as innovators. They were ushering in a new era of warfare, an era where the battlefield is not the trench or the field, but the nursery, the kitchen, and the church. They were proving, with a terrifyingly clean scientific rigor, that you do not need to defeat an army if you can simply break the spirit of the population by burning their homes to the ground. When the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the world was presented with a spectacle of carnage that was, for once, impossible to ignore. The artist Pablo Picasso, a man who possessed the rare and inconvenient talent for seeing the truth when the rest of us were busy squinting at the horizon, took up his brush. He didn't paint a scene of heroic triumph or stoic endurance. He painted a scene of screaming horses, of shattered limbs, of the pure, unfiltered geometry of agony. He painted it in black and white, as if to say that in the face of such a monstrosity, color is an unnecessary distraction. He forced the world to look at the wreckage, not of a military installation, but of the human heart. And how did the world respond to this grim scientific advancement? It expressed its shock, it penned its letters of protest, and then it largely went back to its dinner. The powers of Europe, that grand collection of empires and democracies, wrung their hands and fretted about treaties and balances of power, all the while watching the smoke rise from Spain. They were, in essence, waiting to see if the laboratory experiment might be replicated on a larger scale closer to their own backyards. We are a peculiar animal, the human. We are capable of constructing cathedrals that scrape the heavens and music that can make a stone statue weep. Yet we are also capable of designing a machine specifically to rain fire on a farmer's market on a Monday afternoon. We pride ourselves on our progress, our technology, and our enlightenment. Yet we have not managed to outgrow the primitive impulse to destroy anything that doesn't belong to us. We have simply learned to do it with better equipment. The Bombing of Guernica was the opening chapter of a book that we are, regrettably, still reading. It signaled the death of the gentleman's war, a quaint myth that had long since outlived its usefulness, and the birth of a conflict where there is no front line, no sanctuary, and no end to the reach of the aviator's ambition. It taught us that when the sky is dominated by iron vultures, the earth is no longer a home, but a shooting gallery. One cannot help but wonder what the men in those cockpits thought when they turned their planes back toward the base. Did they feel the weight of their own achievement? Did they boast of their accuracy, their efficiency, their scientific success? Or did they, in the quiet of their own souls, catch a glimpse of the fire they had ignited and realize that they had just opened a door that can never be closed? The history of the world is a long, winding road, paved with the good intentions of people who thought they were building something better, and littered with the debris of those who realized too late that they were just building better ways to die. Guernica stands as a milestone on that road, a jagged, broken monument to the fact that we are a species that can learn to fly, but we have yet to learn how to soar. We have the wings, yes, but we have the hearts of butchers. The artist, in his infinite wisdom, left the tragedy in black and white. Perhaps that is the only way to view the history of our own progress. There is no nuance, there is no shading, and there is no room for the romantic excuses we like to invent for our violence. There is only the fire, the falling metal, and the silence that follows. It is a lesson that the human race has been taught 1,000 times over, and yet, bless our stubborn, forgetful souls, we still seem to need the lesson repeated. We are forever the students who refuse to study, and the world is forever the classroom where the exams are written in blood. In the long, dark ledger of the 20th century, the raid on that small Basque town was but a practice run, a rehearsal for the global bonfire that was being stoked in the halls of power, waiting for the right moment to be lit. And while the world looked on in horror, the vultures merely circled, waiting for the next market day, and the next, and the next. It is a grim, heavy thought, but it is the truth, and the truth, unlike a bomb, does not disappear when the smoke clears. It lingers, it waits, and it demands to be acknowledged, even if we would rather turn our eyes to the sky and pretend that all is well. Chapter 8. The Red Banner on the Floating Ice. There is nothing in this wide, weary world that a man loves more than an empty space on a map. A map, you see, is not merely a guide for travelers. It is an ego in the shape of a rectangle. It demands to be filled. If there is a blank spot on the globe, a desert, a jungle, or a particularly chilly stretch of nothingness, the human species cannot rest until it has stuck a pin in it, given it a name, and declared with all the pompous gravity of a town council meeting that it is now civilized. We have a frantic, itching desire to claim things that have no interest in being claimed. We behave like a neighbor who walks onto a vacant lot, puts up a fence, and starts mowing the lawn, entirely ignoring the fact that the lot is not for sale, has no desire to be mowed, and, most importantly, is currently in the process of sliding down the hillside. In the year 1937, the Soviet Union, a collection of souls currently engaged in the energetic business of trying to build a new world out of the wreckage of the old, decided that the North Pole was far too lonely. It was, they reasoned, a bit of a diplomatic oversight. A pole that belongs to no one is a pole that is not doing its fair share of work for the proletariat. And so they orchestrated a feat of such high-minded bureaucratic absurdity that it deserves to be etched in the annals of human folly alongside the time we collectively decided that the tulip was worth the price of a manor house. They sent a team of brave, if somewhat misguided fellows to fly a plane all the way to the very top of the world. Now, the North Pole is not a place, really. It is a mathematical abstraction, a point where the lines of longitude decide to stop their bickering and meet for a drink. There is no land there. There is no soil. There is only a shifting, groaning, cracking sheet of ice that is perpetually engaged in the act of drifting away from where you left it. It is a place that does not hold still, not for a king, not for a president, and certainly not for a Soviet commissar with a quota to fill. But the Soviets were not to be deterred by the inconvenient reality of a moving target. They landed their plane on a floe, hopped out, and proceeded to set up a camp. They called it North Pole 1. It was a marvel of modern determination. They brought tents, they brought radio sets, and, with the solemnity of a religious pilgrimage, they planted a red flag. They declared, in essence, that this particular block of ice, currently floating southward at the mercy of the currents, was now an extension of their empire. It is a droll thing to contemplate. Imagine, if you will, the sheer, unadulterated hubris required to stand on a piece of frozen ocean miles from solid ground and claim that you are the master of it. It is like standing on a floating log in the middle of the Mississippi and declaring that the log belongs to you and that the river is under your jurisdiction. The river, of course, continues to flow, the log continues to spin, and the man, if he is lucky, keeps his balance long enough to get home for supper. These men, led by a fellow named Papanin, were scientists. That is what they called themselves, anyway. They spent their days observing the weather, measuring the depth of the water, and keeping records of the snow. I have no doubt they were earnest fellows, but one has to wonder what scientific breakthrough they were hoping to achieve by being the first humans to eat borscht, while perched atop a drifting refrigerator. Perhaps they were studying the effect of extreme isolation on the human capacity for bureaucratic record-keeping. The world watched with a sort of bewildered admiration. It was a stunt, of course. It was a play for prestige, a way to tell the rest of the nations of the earth that the Soviet man was made of sterner stuff than the rest of us, that he could endure the cold, ignore the lack of scenery, and turn even the most desolate, uninhabitable waste into a station for progress. It was an advertisement written in ice for the triumph of will over geography. And yet there is something deeply, undeniably human about it. We are a species that likes to plant flags. We put flags on mountains we cannot breathe on, flags on moons we cannot live on, and flags on ice floes that are destined to melt into the sea by August. We are desperate to leave our mark. We are so terrified of the thought that the universe might not know we were here that we will drag our banners to the ends of the earth just to prove we could make the trip. One wonders what the polar bears thought of it all. I imagine they looked on with a bemused, ursine curiosity. Here were these strange, pink-skinned creatures arriving in a mechanical bird, clambering out, and immediately setting up a telegraph office. The bears likely found it no more sensible than the time the ice decided to crack in half, or the time the seals decided to migrate. To a polar bear, the world is a place of fish and hunger. To a Soviet scientist, the world is a place of reports and quotas. They were two different species inhabiting the same reality, and I am not entirely certain which one had the better grasp of the situation. The irony, of course, was that while these men were busy claiming the North Pole for their own, the pole itself was, in its indifferent geological way, moving on without them. The camp was not stationary. It was a vessel without a rudder. Every day the ice beneath their feet carried them a few miles further away from the North Pole, and a few miles closer to the oblivion of the Atlantic. They were drifting into irrelevance, and they were doing it with the absolute unshakable dignity of a state-sanctioned enterprise. There is a lesson here, though I suspect the commissars in Moscow missed the point entirely. It is that nature does not care for our borders. Nature does not care for our flags. You can paint a banner the color of a sunset and drive a pole into the crust of the earth, but the earth will just keep on spinning, and the ice will just keep on melting, and the tides will just keep on pulling us where they please. We are all, in a sense, living on a drifting ice floe. We are all on a journey we did not choose, toward a destination we cannot control, busily measuring the temperature and writing our reports as if the results mattered to the wind. When the ice finally gave way and the scientists were brought home, they were celebrated as heroes. They had conquered the Arctic. They had survived. They had planted the banner, and the world cheered, because we love a hero who survives a folly. We love to see the man who goes out into the void and comes back with a story to tell. But I think of that patch of ice, long since dissolved into the gray waters of the northern seas. I think of the silence that reclaimed that spot, the way the snow covered the tracks, and the way the sea smoothed over the memory of the camp. It is the most honest outcome for any such endeavor. The earth takes back what is hers. The flags rot, the ink fades, and the maps are redrawn, but the North Pole remains what it has always been, a place that does not want to be found and certainly does not want to be owned. It was a year of such marvelous, desperate, and ultimately fruitless posturing. We were all acting as if we had reached the pinnacle of our capabilities, building our machines, drawing our lines, and shouting our ideologies across the snowy expanse. And all the while, the planet was just a big wet rock spinning through the dark, entirely unimpressed by our politics. I suppose that is the charm of the 1937 expedition. It was the epitome of human earnestness, to take a plane to the top of the world just to sit on a block of ice and wait for the spring thaw. It is a kind of insanity, yes, but it is a uniquely human kind of insanity. We do not just survive the elements. We try to turn them into an office. We do not just endure the cold. We try to file it away in a cabinet. We are so obsessed with structure that we will bring it to the one place on earth where structure is an illusion. The red banner on the floating ice was not a conquest. It was a testament. It was a testament to the fact that man will never be satisfied until he has tried to govern the ungovernable, to measure the immeasurable, and to plant his flag on the very thing that is trying to drown him. It is a foolish, beautiful, and utterly doomed enterprise. And if we ever stop doing it, if we ever stop going out to the edges of the map just to see what's there and to see if we can stand on it for a few months, then I reckon we will have stopped being human altogether. We might as well be the polar bears waiting for the seals to show up, which, come to think of it, doesn't sound like such a bad way to spend an afternoon. But we are men, and we are cursed with the need to be elsewhere, even if that elsewhere is a drifting piece of ice in the middle of a frozen hell. Chapter 9. The Genesis of the Rolling Basket. There is a particular brand of agony known only to the housewife of the early 20th century, a tragedy of the shoulder and the wrist, a wearying, bone-deep fatigue that set in precisely at the moment the grocery basket became too heavy to lift. In those days, a trip to the market was a test of strength, a feat of endurance akin to a march across the desert, save for the fact that one was hauling canned peaches and sacks of flour instead of water skins. The limit of the modern family's consumption was not governed by their budget, nor by the size of their pantry, nor even by the appetite of their children. No, it was governed entirely by the strength of the human bicep. When the arm grew weary, the shopping stopped. It was a simple, physical, and profoundly inconvenient law of nature. In the year of our Lord 1937, in the fair and dusty city of Oklahoma City, a grocer by the name of Sylvan Goldman found himself staring at this law and deciding, with the stubborn arrogance of a man who prefers to make his own rules, that it was time for it to be repealed. Sylvan was a man who viewed the grocery store not as a place of mere utility, but as a temple of commerce that was currently failing to live up to its potential because his customers simply couldn't carry enough loot. The problem, as Sylvan saw it, was the basket. It was a perfectly serviceable vessel, to be sure, but it was anchored to the human frame by the fallible and finite mechanism of the hand. He sat in his office, likely nursing a cold cup of coffee, and watching the throngs of shoppers shuffle through his aisles, dropping their purchases when their arms began to ache, and heading for the checkout with only half of what they might have otherwise bought. He was a man with an invention in his gut, a vision of the future that would one day lead to the modern American habit of buying 3 times as much as one actually requires, just because the vessel was large enough to hold it. The inspiration, as is so often the case with these world-altering breakthroughs, arrived not in a flash of lightning or a dream of the heavens, but in the most mundane, uninspired fashion imaginable. Sylvan looked at a folding chair. It is the sort of object that exists in the background of every life, a flimsy, metal and wood contrivance that is neither comfortable to sit upon nor particularly pleasant to look at. But Sylvan saw in that chair a destiny. He imagined, with a mind that surely leaned toward the Rube Goldbergian, that if one were to take that chair, affix a pair of wheels to the legs, and strap a basket onto the seat, one would have a device that could liberate the shopper from the tyranny of gravity. He went to his handyman, a fellow whose name is lost to the tides of history, but whose contribution was surely the most significant leap forward for the American consumer since the invention of the refrigerated box, and they set to work. They took the chair, they bent the metal, they attached the wheels, and they placed the basket upon it. The result was a contraption that looked for all the world like a baby carriage that had been put together by a man who had never seen a baby. It was clunky, it was ungainly, and it had the aesthetic grace of a kitchen stove on roller skates. And yet it worked. When Sylvan unveiled his folding basket carrier in the aisles of his Humpty Dumpty grocery store, he awaited the applause of the masses. He waited for the throngs to descend, to snatch up the carts, to fill them with cans of soup and boxes of crackers until the wheels groaned under the weight. He waited for the profits to soar. The public, however, had other ideas. They did not rush to the carts. They did not scramble to push the metal marvels through the aisles. In fact, they ignored them with a consistency that was almost insulting. The men of the town in particular looked at the rolling baskets with a deep, existential suspicion. They were, in their own minds, creatures of masculine independence. To push a cart through a grocery store, they reasoned, was a task that felt suspiciously like pushing a baby carriage. And to a man of the 1930s, that was a bridge too far. It was not manly to walk through a store behind a wire cage on wheels. It was an admission of weakness, a public declaration that one was not strong enough to carry his own bag of potatoes like a proper pioneer. The women, for their part, were just as unimpressed. They had spent their entire lives carrying baskets. They were used to the ache. They knew how to distribute the weight, how to balance the milk against the melons, and they viewed the cart as a bulky, intrusive, and unnecessary complication in an already crowded shop. They did not want to navigate the aisles around a metal contraption that made the store feel smaller and the shopping feel like a chore. Sylvan Goldman, who had invested his heart and his bank account in the idea, was faced with a classic American dilemma. He had the better mousetrap, but the mice were perfectly happy with their old traps and saw no reason to change. He did not give up. No, Sylvan decided that if the public would not adopt the cart for its utility, he would force them to adopt it through the oldest, most reliable method in the history of human persuasion: jealousy. He hired a group of young, attractive, and conspicuously fashionable men and women to walk through his store during the peak hours, pushing the carts. They were not shopping for themselves, mind you. They were shopping for the sake of the theater. They would fill their carts with products, walk the aisles with an air of sophisticated ease, and make sure that every other shopper in the store saw just how effortless, how modern, and how utterly superior the cart user looked compared to the poor, struggling soul straining under the weight of a heavy wicker basket. It was a master stroke of psychological warfare. The shoppers watched. They whispered. They saw the cool people, the trendsetters, the ones who looked like they knew a secret that the rest of the world was missing, gliding through the aisles with their carts piled high, looking for all the world like kings and queens of the commodity kingdom. And just as Sylvan had anticipated, they began to crack. One by one, the reluctant shoppers would approach a cart, test the handle, and give it a tentative push. Once they tried it, they were hooked. There is an addictive quality to the cart that I suspect Sylvan did not fully appreciate. It is the ability to walk through a store and pick up things you do not need, things you did not plan to buy, and things you would never have even looked at had your arms not been so conveniently free. The cart is an enabler of appetite. It tells the brain, there is plenty of room for more, and the brain being the suggestible, greedy organ that it is, immediately agrees. The cart turned the grocery store from a place of necessity into a place of exploration, a buffet for the eyes where the only limit was the volume of the wire cage. Within a few years, the folding basket carrier had conquered the continent. It had become the symbol of the American way of life, a life of abundance, of convenience, and of the pursuit of more. We had mastered the art of the haul. We no longer walked out of the store with a bag. We walked out with a cart full, a trunk full, a pantry full. We had optimized the errand to the point of absurdity. Looking back on it now, one has to marvel at the sheer mundane brilliance of the thing. It was a triumph of the common man's ingenuity. A grocer in Oklahoma, frustrated by the physical limitations of his customers, changed the way the entire world consumes. He took the chair, the wheel, and the basket, and he created the infrastructure of the modern supermarket. He didn't just sell groceries, he sold the capacity for excess. And so, the rolling basket became a permanent fixture of our existence. We are now so tethered to them that the sight of a person carrying a basket in a large store feels, to us, like a failure of imagination. We need the cart. We need the wheels. We need the promise that we can bring home the entire store if we have the mind to do it. It is a devilish device in its own way, a tool that tricks us into believing that our lives are defined by how much we can move from the shelf to the car and from the car to the kitchen. But it is also a testament to our stubborn, persistent refusal to do things the hard way. If there is a hill to climb, we want a car. If there is a store to conquer, we want a cart. We are the laziest, most productive, and most creatively impatient creatures that ever walked the face of this earth, and I, for one, wouldn't have it any other way. Though I must admit, the next time I find myself behind a man who has decided to park his cart sideways in the aisle to ponder the relative merits of two different brands of tinned peas, I shall have to restrain myself from wishing that Sylvan Goldman had never been born. But such is the price of progress, a little bit of convenience and a whole lot of traffic. Chapter 10. The Synthetic Thread of Miraculous Strength. There is a sort of divine arrogance in the way we humans look at a worm, a beetle, or a spider and think, I could do that better, and I could do it without having to eat the mulberry leaves. For centuries, the silkworm has reigned as the undisputed, tiny, and rather moist sovereign of the textile world. It has been a demanding, labor-intensive, and entirely uncooperative employee, spinning its precious thread in the dark, quiet corners of the Orient, forcing us to go through the trouble of raising it, coddling it, and, in a rather ungrateful turn of events, boiling it alive just to get a yard of fabric for a lady's scarf. It was a primitive arrangement, to be sure. It relied on the whim of a creature that possessed the brain capacity of a raisin, and it made the price of elegance so high that only the very rich could afford to drape themselves in the stuff. Humanity, in its restless, industrious, and deeply dissatisfied state, eventually looked at this biological monopoly and decided that it was time to break the union. We wanted the luster of the silk, the strength of the fiber, and the vanity of the fashion, but we wanted it without the middleman. We wanted the miracle, but we wanted it manufactured in a factory, preferably by a man in a white coat who didn't mind working on weekends. In 1937, the fine, clean-cut gentleman at the DuPont laboratory, a place where the air likely smelled of ambition and scorched chemicals, decided to play the role of the creator. They set out to synthesize a fiber, not just any fiber, mind you, but one that would be stronger than steel, finer than a spider's whisper, and entirely indifferent to the needs of the silkworm. They were, in essence, attempting to conjure something out of nothing, or at the very least, out of the most unpromising ingredients one could imagine: coal, water, and air. Now, if you were to tell a man in the Middle Ages that you could take a lump of black coal, a bucket of swamp water, and the very air he breathed, and turn them into a pair of stockings that would make a debutante weep with joy, he would have either burned you for a warlock or asked you for a loan. But in the 1930s, we called it science. The scientists, led by the brilliant and somewhat tragic Wallace Carruthers, engaged in a grand game of molecular musical chairs. They twisted, linked, and rearranged the fundamental building blocks of matter until they produced a polymer, a substance that sounded like a sneeze but acted like a bridge cable. They called it nylon. It was a name that felt like a punch, a name that was designed to sound modern, to sound fast, and to sound like it had absolutely nothing to do with worms. The public, when they heard of this, were understandably bewildered. A thread made of coal? A stocking made of water? It sounded like the sort of nonsense one hears at a traveling circus, or in the back room of a patent medicine salesman. And yet, when they saw the first samples, they were stunned. It possessed a sheen that rivaled the finest silk, a durability that would put a blacksmith's apron to shame, and a stretch that allowed it to cling to the leg with the persistence of a tax collector. It was a revolution. Overnight, the silkworm found itself looking at an early retirement. The ladies of the world, who had long resigned themselves to the fragile, snaggable nature of silk hosiery, a fabric that would run if you merely looked at it with a harsh thought, suddenly found themselves in possession of a miracle. These nylon stockings were indestructible, or so the marketing men claimed. They were the perfect marriage of science and vanity. You could wear them to a gala, you could wear them to a dance, and for all I know, you could probably use them to tow a Model T out of a mud puddle if the situation required it. But there is an inherent irony in the nature of human progress. We take the most complex, the most sophisticated, and the most groundbreaking scientific achievements, the culmination of years of labor by the finest minds in the country, and what do we do with them? We use them to improve the appearance of our ankles. It is a grand, dizzying commentary on our species. We unlock the secrets of the molecular structure of the universe. We master the art of synthesizing the very stuff of creation, and our first instinct is to use it for hosiery. It is as if we were given the keys to the Library of Alexandria and used the papyrus to wrap our sandwiches. Of course, the genius of nylon did not stop at the hem of a stocking. It was a material of such versatile, stubborn strength that it was destined for far more serious matters. Before long, the same substance that was gracing the legs of the American socialite was being considered for the ropes of naval vessels, the bristles of toothbrushes, and, as the clouds of war began to gather on the horizon, the chutes of parachutes. The very thing that was born of the need to look pretty was destined to become the literal lifeline for the soldier in the sky. There is something rather poetic about that. The synthetic thread, the miracle fiber created by the DuPont chemists to liberate us from the silkworm, became the binding material of the century. It was the stuff of glamour, and then in a blink, the stuff of survival. It was a reminder that in the modern world, the line between luxury and necessity is often just a matter of circumstance. But I suspect the chemists, in their sterile, gleaming laboratories, were not thinking of parachutes or naval ropes when they first saw that shimmering strand of polymer emerge from the retort. They were thinking of the sheer, unadulterated joy of having done what nature had taken millions of years to perfect. They were the masters of the lab, the alchemists of the industrial age, and they had proven that they could produce a better thread than the worm. The poor silkworm, for its part, has continued to spin its thread in its quiet, ancient way, entirely oblivious to the fact that its monopoly has been broken. It still eats its leaves, it still spins its cocoon, and it still, in all likelihood, considers itself the greatest engineer in the animal kingdom. And perhaps, in a way, it is right. For while we can imitate the silk, while we can synthesize the luster, and while we can churn the stuff out by the mile in our roaring factories, we have never quite managed to replicate the quiet, patient, and entirely indifferent artistry of the worm. We can create the fiber, but we cannot create the mystery. We can make the thread, but we cannot make the life that wove it. And in that, perhaps, the worm still holds the advantage. Though, I dare say, if you ask a woman on Fifth Avenue whether she would rather have a pair of delicate, run-prone silk stockings or a pair of indestructible nylon ones, she would choose the nylon every time. Progress, after all, has a way of making us quite practical about our vanities. So, here we are, in 1937, draped in the wonders of the chemical age. We are walking on synthetic soles, we are wearing synthetic stockings, and we are looking forward to a future where everything is made in a test tube. It is a world of incredible synthetic convenience. We have cheated the worm, we have outsmarted the spider, and we have conquered the loom. We are the masters of the fiber, and if we ever find ourselves in need of a good, strong rope to pull us out of the mess we've made of this century, we can rest assured that it will be made of nylon, the triumph of coal, water, and air, brought to you by the men who decided that nature was simply too slow for the pace of the modern world. It is a marvelous thing, really, a bit cold, a bit metallic, and entirely devoid of the soul of the silkworm, but marvelous nonetheless. And that, I suppose, is the story of our time. We keep making the world shinier, stronger, and more efficient, all the while forgetting that the soft, fragile, and utterly imperfect things are the ones that usually possess the most character. But then, nobody ever asked a stocking to have character, did they? They only asked it not to run, and in that, at least, the chemists have given us a victory. Chapter 11. The Blood on the Memorial Day Grass. There is a peculiar, almost theatrical irony in the way we celebrate our national holidays. We designate a day, usually a warm, pleasant one, to remember the fallen, to reflect upon the sacrifices of those who laid down their lives for the cause of liberty, and to stand in respectful silence while brass bands play music that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby for the afterlife. We hold these days in such high esteem that one would think we had mastered the art of peace, when in truth we have merely mastered the art of polishing the monuments to our own discord. Memorial Day, in particular, is a day for flags, for bunting, and for politicians to stand before a microphone and tell us how much they value the freedom of the common man, all the while praying that the common man does not take that freedom too literally. In the year of our Lord 1937, the fine city of Chicago, a place where the wind is said to be the only thing that travels faster than a rumor, decided to offer its own peculiar contribution to the history of the holiday. It was not a contribution of speeches or parades, but one of leaden tragedy, played out on the green, unsuspecting grass outside the gates of the Republic Steel plant. You see, while the folks in Washington were busy crafting a new deal, sketching out a grand, benevolent future where every man might have a job and every job might have a living wage, the people on the ground in Chicago were discovering that the local police force had not quite received the memo. In fact, it appeared that the boys in blue had misinterpreted the New Deal entirely. They seemed to be under the impression that it was a brand new deal for them, and that the cards were stacked in their favor specifically for the purpose of striking the skulls of anyone who dared to ask for a seat at the table. The marchers were simple folk. They were steel workers, men who spent their days bathed in the infernal glow of the furnace and their nights dreaming of a few extra cents in their pay envelopes. They were not revolutionaries in the grand explosive sense. They were merely people who had grown tired of the arrangement that required them to work until they dropped, only to be replaced by the next eager fellow standing in the unemployment line. They came to the gates not with tanks or artillery, but with their wives, their children, and a picnic-like air of optimism that was, in hindsight, dangerously naive. They believed, perhaps foolishly, that the laws of the land protected them. They believed that they had the right to assemble, the right to petition, and the right to walk across a public road without being treated like an invading army. It is a charming delusion, the belief that the written law is stronger than the swinging nightstick. It is the sort of thing that looks wonderful in a school book and feels absolutely nothing like reality when you are standing in a field and a squadron of officers, eyes glazed with the singular intoxicating purpose of authority, decides that your presence is an affront to the dignity of the establishment. The confrontation, when it came, was not a skirmish. It was a performance. The police, lined up like chess pieces on a board, were waiting for a reason. Or perhaps they didn't feel the need for a reason at all. It was Memorial Day, after all. Perhaps they felt it was a fine day to add a few new names to the roster of those who would be remembered in future parades. When the order was given, the air did not fill with diplomatic discourse. It filled with the sound of snapping wood, the pops of gunfire, and the screams of people who had come out for a walk and ended up in a butcher shop. It is a difficult thing to describe the brutality of that afternoon without sounding like a man who has lost his grip on his own humor, but I shall try. It was a chaotic, bloody, and thoroughly unnecessary mess. There were men who had been walking with their hands in their pockets only to find them filled with lead. There were women who had come to support their husbands only to be struck down by the very people who were paid to keep the peace. It was a massacre of the most mundane and terrifying variety, a collision between the unstoppable force of collective demand and the immovable object of institutional arrogance. When the smoke cleared and the grass was stained with something far more permanent than dew, the official reports began to trickle out, and they were, as one might expect, works of fiction that would have made a dime novel writer blush. It was claimed with straight faces and furrowed brows that the workers had been armed, that they had been the aggressors, and that the police had merely been defending themselves against a riotous mob. One can almost see the humor in it, if one's heart weren't so heavy. The image of a man holding a sandwich and a Union placard being equated to a revolutionary with a grenade, it is the sort of distortion that could only be maintained by people who are entirely convinced that history is written by those who hold the biggest sticks. The tragedy of the Memorial Day massacre was not merely that people died. It was that the world learned once again the oldest lesson in the book, that the government, when it chooses to act in its own self-interest, has no use for the very liberties it celebrates on holidays. The New Deal might have been the rhetoric of the Capitol, but the nightstick was the reality of the street. It was a stark reminder that as long as the people who have the power are the ones who make the rules will always be designed to keep the power exactly where it is. One cannot help but think of those who lay on the grass that day, looking up at the sky, wondering how it all went so wrong. They had wanted nothing more than a fair day's pay, a bit of dignity, and the simple, quiet life of a worker. Instead, they were given a place in the history books, a place they never asked for and a price they never should have had to pay. They were the casualties of a war that wasn't supposed to be happening, a war between the promise of a better tomorrow and the cold, unyielding machinery of a today that refused to change. The authorities, of course, went back to their dinners. The press, for the most part, printed the stories they were told. And the world moved on because the world is a busy, forgetful place. And it has a habit of looking away whenever things get too messy. But the stain on the grass remained. It remained as a silent, invisible mark on the conscience of the city, a reminder that on a day we set aside to honor the sacrifice of the dead, we proved that we were still quite capable of creating more of them. It is a grim business, the history of the working man. It is a history written in sweat, in tears, and on days like that Memorial Day, in blood. And yet, there is something persistent about us. We keep marching, we keep gathering, we keep asking for our fair share, even when we know that the answer is likely to be a blow to the head. We are a stubborn, foolish, and endlessly hopeful species. We look at the past, we look at the blood on the grass, and we stand up and march again because we know that if we don't, the story will never change. And perhaps that is the only way to honor the memory of the fallen, not with flags, not with speeches, and certainly not with the hollow assurances of those who hold the power. The only way to honor them is to keep the question alive, to keep the demand for justice echoing in the streets, and to refuse, no matter how hard the nightstick falls, to go quietly into the dark. It is a dangerous, difficult, and entirely necessary business, this business of being a citizen. And as I sit here writing of these things, I cannot help but wonder how many more Memorial Days will we need before we learn that the best way to honor the dead is to stop creating them? But that, I fear, is a question that requires a wisdom we have yet to acquire. For now, we shall continue to march, and the police shall continue to swing their clubs, and the world will continue to spin, indifferent to the cost of our progress. It is a grand, tragic comedy, and the curtain, alas, never falls. Chapter 12. The Great Depression's Uninvited Younger Brother. It is a grand, marvelous delusion that humanity suffers from, the belief that the world possesses a memory. We operate under the touching, if entirely unfounded conviction that because we have suffered through a catastrophe, the universe has somehow recorded the lesson in its permanent ledger and will spare us a repeat performance. We treat the past as a finished book, shelved and dusty, forgetting that time is a circular track and we are merely the donkeys walking it, convinced with every step that we are going somewhere new. In the year of our Lord 1937, the American people had just about finished convincing themselves that they had reached the end of the long, dark tunnel of the Great Depression. They were dusting off their optimism, tightening their hats, and preparing to step out into the sunshine of a recovered economy. The factories were beginning to hum a tune that sounded vaguely like prosperity. The trains were running, and the radio was full of the sort of chatter that suggested the worst was behind us. We had been through the mill, we had been ground down to the bone, and now we were ready to start the feast. And then, just as we were setting the table, the Great Depression's uninvited younger brother arrived, kicked the door in, and helped himself to the last of the bread. This younger brother, the recession of 1937, though the economists and the newspapermen gave it all sorts of fancy, sterile names to make it sound like a technical glitch rather than a disaster, was a nasty, spiteful little thing. It didn't have the grand, epic tragedy of the initial collapse of 1929. It didn't have the panache of a ruined empire or the spectacle of the breadlines stretching into the next county. No, it was a quiet, creeping sort of misery. It was the feeling of a man who has finally found a steady job, only to have the ground pulled out from beneath his boots. The financial machinery of the 20th century, which the experts had promised us was now properly oiled and regulated, turned out to be about as reliable as a clockwork mouse that has been left out in the rain. It sputtered, it wheezed, and then it simply stopped. The stock market, which had been climbing back up the mountain with the tenacity of a mountain goat, suddenly decided that the air was too thin and plunged back into the valley with the speed of a falling anvil. It was a baffling business. The politicians in Washington, with their slide rules and their furrowed brows, blamed the bankers. The bankers, with their cigars and their mahogany desks, blamed the president. The industrialists blamed the unions, and the unions blamed the industrialists. Everyone had a theory, and everyone had a finger pointed at someone else's chest. It was a marvelous circular argument, a closed-loop system of blame that did absolutely nothing to fix the fact that the money had once again decided to go on holiday. I have often thought that if one wants to understand the true hidden nature of the economy, one should not consult the men who study it in ivory towers. One should instead look at the family cat. When the cat is fed, the house is a place of peace and contentment. When the cat is hungry, it becomes a creature of chaotic, unpredictable aggression. The economy is very much like that cat. It is a temperamental, volatile, and profoundly selfish beast that cares nothing for the carefully drafted plans of men. It responds to moods, to whispers, and to shadows. And in 1937, the cat decided it didn't like the look of things, and it bit the hand that was trying to pet it. The panic was not a loud, screaming thing. It was a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of the national stomach. It was the realization that we were not out of the woods after all. We were merely in a slightly brighter part of the forest, and the shadows were closing in again. It was the recession within a depression, a phrase so delightfully bureaucratic that it makes one want to laugh until the tears come. It is like calling a house fire a spontaneous change in thermal state, or a shipwreck, an unplanned maritime relocation. It was a catastrophe wrapped in a lie, delivered with the professional indifference of a funeral director. One must admire the sheer, galling arrogance of the people in charge. They spent their days in the Capitol, passing laws and signing papers, believing that if they only found the right combination of words, they could command the economy to behave. They acted as if the market were a stubborn mule that just needed the right kind of persuasion. But the market, as it always does, proved that it is neither a mule nor a machine. It is a ghost. It is a collection of fears, greeds, hopes, and delusions, all masquerading as a system. And you cannot legislate fear. You cannot pass an act of Congress to cure the sudden cold dread that grips a man when he looks at his bank book and realizes that his future has just been canceled. The tragedy of the younger brother was that it took the last bit of air out of the room. The initial crash had been a shock, a sudden blow that left us gasping, but this was an exhaustion. It was the feeling of a runner who, having sprinted until his lungs were burning, finally reaches the finish line, only to be told that the race is actually twice as long as he thought, and he has to start again right now without a drink of water. The shops began to empty again. The lights in the factories began to flicker and die. The soup kitchens, which had been hoping to close their doors, were forced to put out the welcome sign once more. It was a bleak, dusty, and deeply familiar nightmare. We had been down this road. We knew the scenery, and we knew exactly how the story ended. With more shivering, more hunger, and more long, anxious nights spent listening to the wind and wondering if the morning would ever bring a shred of good news. What made it truly, spectacularly infuriating was that there was no good reason for it. We were not at war. We were not in the midst of a famine. We had the food, we had the steel, we had the hands, and we had the brains. We were living in a land of plenty, and yet, because of a ledger entry in a bank in New York and a disagreement in a boardroom, we were forced to go without. It is the sort of madness that makes one want to march into the street and demand an explanation, though one suspects that the explanation would be delivered in a language so dry and so detached from reality that it would only make the madness more profound. The younger brother proved, if nothing else, that we had not built a world that was stable. We had built a world that was brittle. We had constructed a grand, soaring architecture of finance that was designed to catch the sunlight, but it had no foundation in the earth. It was a house of cards, and whenever the wind blew, whenever someone got scared, or someone got greedy, or someone decided to play a game of political chicken, the whole structure would shudder. I suppose that is the burden of the modern age. We are no longer farmers living on the land, beholden only to the rain and the sun. We are creatures of the ticker tape and the banknote. We are bound to a system that operates on faith, and faith, as anyone with a passing acquaintance with human nature knows, is the most fragile of all commodities. It takes a generation to build and a moment to destroy. As the months dragged on, the hope of 1937 began to look like a fool's errand. The recession settled in, and the world grew quiet. The politicians continued to argue, the newspapers continued to spin their tales, and the people continued to wait, their coats buttoned tight against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a grim, gray time, a time when the dreams of the decade seemed to turn to ash, and yet we survived. We always do. We are a resilient, miserable, and persistent lot. We take our licks, we grumble, we go to bed hungry, and we wake up the next morning and try to figure out how to put the pieces back together. We don't change the game. Heaven forbid we do anything so radical as that. But we keep playing, betting our last nickel on the hope that the next roll of the dice will be the one that saves us. The Great Depression's younger brother eventually grew bored and wandered off to look for trouble elsewhere, leaving behind a wake of broken hearts and empty pockets. But he left us with a parting gift, the knowledge that the ground beneath our feet is never as solid as it looks, and that the recovery is just a story we tell ourselves to get through the night. It was a hard, cold, and entirely unnecessary lesson, but it is one that we learned well. And as for the financial wizards and the men who pull the levers of the world, I suspect they learned nothing at all. They are probably sitting in their offices even now waiting for the next clockwork mouse to stop ticking so they can tell us all about why it happened and how it surely, definitely, positively won't happen again. One can only hope they are wrong for the sake of the next generation of donkeys walking this circular track, but I wouldn't bet the farm on it. Chapter 13. The Misunderstanding at the Marco Polo Bridge. There is a particular brand of human stupidity that reaches its full blossoming maturity only when it is dressed in the uniform of a soldier and given a map of a place it does not belong. It is a quiet, diligent sort of stupidity, the kind that can look at a stone bridge that has stood for centuries, a bridge adorned with hundreds of carved stone lions, each one possessing a face of noble, silent patience, and decide that the most pressing business at hand is to use the structure as a pretext for a catastrophe of continental proportions. In the year of our Lord 1937, on a night that was otherwise unremarkable, the Imperial Japanese Army found itself in a state of high dudgeon near Peking. They were encamped near the Marco Polo Bridge, a structure that had been watching the comings and goings of history since the days when the Mongol emperors were the talk of the town. The bridge, being a stone object of fixed habits, had seen it all: wars, floods, tax collectors, and the occasional merchant with a caravan of silk. It had, until this moment, never had the distinct displeasure of witnessing a modern international incident triggered by the biological necessity of a single private. It seems that during the evening maneuvers a soldier had wandered off. He had gone, as the common man is wont to do, to find a secluded spot to relieve himself, or perhaps to share a cigarette with the shadows, or simply to take a nap in the tall grass. He was missing for a matter of an hour. In any other setting, in any other corner of the globe, this would have been a non-event. A sergeant would have cursed, a search party would have been dispatched with a lantern, and the soldier would have eventually emerged from the bushes, sheepish and adjusting his belt, to receive a boot to the backside for his trouble. But the Imperial Army, bless its collective, rigid heart, did not operate on the principle of the boot. It operated on the principle of the incident. The commanders, who had been sitting in their tents for weeks, twiddling their thumbs and waiting for the great opportunity to arrive so they might justify the expense of their ammunition, saw in this missing soldier not a wayward boy, but a gift from the gods. A soldier is missing. How tragic, how scandalous, how absolutely convenient. Within an hour of the lad's disappearance, the gears of the war machine began to grind. It was a beautiful, efficient, and thoroughly terrifying spectacle of bureaucratic momentum. The soldiers were roused, the rifles were checked, and the artillery was hauled into position. They didn't bother to wait for the poor fellow to return, for had he returned, the entire pretext would have evaporated like morning mist in the desert. They needed him to be missing. They needed the idea of him to be the match that lit the fuse. And so, under the cover of a missing private, the Army launched a full-scale assault on the Chinese Republic. They began to fire upon the local garrisons. They began to move their troops, and they began to manufacture a war out of thin air. It was a master class in the art of the false excuse. It reminds me of the time a neighbor of mine in Missouri accused the local squirrel of stealing his hat, and finding no hat, proceeded to chop down every tree in the county just in case the squirrel had hidden it in one of them. The audacity of it was staggering. Here was a civilization, a vast, ancient, and deeply complex China, being dismantled piece by piece because a soldier had gone for a walk. The Polo Bridge Incident became the spark that ignited a blaze of such monstrous proportions that it would eventually consume millions of lives, destroy cities, and redraw the maps of the world. And all for a fellow who, I suspect, was likely just looking for a quiet place to sit down. The Chinese, caught in the sudden, violent surge of this manufactured outrage, found themselves in the position of a man who has had his house broken into by a guest who complains that the door was not open wide enough. The Japanese commanders, in their infinite self-serving wisdom, demanded that the Chinese authorities allow them to conduct searches for the missing man. They demanded access to the fortresses, the barracks, and the towns. They were, in essence, demanding the keys to the kingdom under the guise of looking for a lost hat. It is a fascinating study in the psychology of empires. An empire, you see, is never truly satisfied. It is a creature of insatiable hunger, always looking for a reason to expand, always looking for a slight to avenge, and always looking for a misunderstanding that it can exploit. And when it finds one, a missing soldier, a broken treaty, a diplomatic insult, it pounces upon it with the joy of a child finding a new toy. They do not want peace. They want justification. They want to be able to say, with a straight face and a trembling lip, "Look what they have done to us. We had no choice but to invade." The irony, of course, is that the missing soldier returned to his unit shortly after the shooting started. He had simply gotten lost, had a bit of a wander, and found his way back, probably quite surprised to find that his modest personal inconvenience had been transformed into the casus belli for a global conflict. I often wonder what he thought of it all. Did he stand there watching the artillery thunder against the horizon and think, "Good heavens, I only went to find a tree"? Or did he, like a good soldier, simply shrug his shoulders, accept the new reality, and get on with the business of being a cog in the machine? There is a profound, aching madness in the way we conduct the affairs of nations. We place the fate of millions in the hands of people who are looking for an excuse to pull the trigger. We have built a world where the trigger is always loaded, where the gun is always pointed at the neighbor, and where we are all just waiting for someone to drop their pocket knife so we can claim it as an act of war. The Marco Polo Bridge, with its stone lions, continued to stand. It had seen the Mongols, it had seen the Manchus, and now it was seeing the modern age with its iron birds and its thunderous guns. I suspect that if the stone lions could speak, they would have a great deal to say about the brevity of human grievances and the absurdity of our excuses. They would tell us that we are all merely passing through, that the borders we draw in the dust are destined to be blown away by the first stiff breeze, and that for all our posturing and our misunderstandings, we are just tiny, frantic creatures fighting over a bridge that has survived us all and will continue to survive us long after we have turned to dust. But the generals did not listen to the lions. They were too busy writing their communiques, sending their telegrams, and declaring their righteousness. They were too busy being important. They were busy turning a moment of human fallibility into a monument of human failure. It is the classic tragedy of the diplomat, the general, and the statesman. They cannot allow a moment of peace, for peace provides no opportunity for glory. They cannot allow a misunderstanding to be resolved, for a resolution provides no leverage for conquest. They must nurse the wound, they must inflame the grievance, and they must turn the small, jagged rock of a minor incident into the mountain of a war. And so the invasion began. The Japanese swept through the landscape, the Chinese resisted, and the world, that great, nervous, and ultimately cowardly observer, looked on, waiting to see who would win, and checking to see if the fire would spread to their own porches. It was the beginning of a conflict that would eventually swallow the Pacific, a conflict that would bring the world to the brink of ruin, and all of it, every last drop of blood, every scorched village, every ruined life, can be traced back to that hour of silence when one man was missing in the grass near the Bridge of the Lions. It is a sobering thought, is it not? That the trajectory of human history is so fragile, so susceptible to the whims of the small and the small-minded. We like to think that we are steered by the great hands of destiny, or the wise counsels of the learned, or the grand designs of Providence. But I am convinced that if you could look behind the curtain of history, you wouldn't find a grand design at all. You would find a series of accidents, a pile of excuses, and a great many men who were simply looking for a reason to start a fight. The Marco Polo Bridge still stands, I believe. It remains as a silent stone sentinel, a witness to the folly of our species. And every time I think of that missing soldier and the army that used him as a stalking horse for an empire, I think of the stone lions. They have seen it all, and they have kept their counsel. They know that the world is a stage, that the actors are merely playing their parts, and that the play, no matter how tragic, how bloody, or how absurd, is destined to come to an end, leaving the stage exactly as it was, empty, silent, and waiting for the next set of fools to try their hand at the lines. We are a stubborn, quarrelsome, and entirely ridiculous race. We build our bridges, we walk across them, and we use them as excuses to tear down the world. And then we wonder why we are so tired, why the world is so broken, and why we can never seem to find the peace we claim to desire. Perhaps if we spent less time looking for excuses to be angry and more time looking at the lions, we might find a bit of perspective. But that, I fear, is a hope for a future that is still a long way off. For now, we shall continue to have our misunderstandings, and we shall continue to pay for them with the currency of our own lives. And that, I reckon, is the most tragic part of the whole miserable business. Chapter 14. The Bitter Fall of the Ancient Capital. It is a curious vanity that human beings possess, this desire to sign their names upon pieces of parchment, embellished with wax seals, ribbons, and the signatures of men who have never seen a battlefield, and to believe, with a faith that would put a saint to shame, that such scribblings might actually stop a bullet. We are very fond of these treaties. We convene the grandest councils. We debate the fine points of international decorum with the earnestness of schoolboys arguing over the rules of marbles, and we declare, with voices raised to the rafters of the halls of power, that we have at last brought order to the chaos of war. We have the Hague Convention. We have the League of Nations. We have protocols and accords and agreements that are, in theory, the very architecture of a civilized world. But when the year 1937 turned its gaze upon the ancient capital of China, Nanking, the world was given a lesson in the durability of these documents that was written in a hand so stark and so bloody that no amount of parchment could ever hope to scrub it clean. Nanking was, until the winter of that year, a place that held the weight of centuries within its walls. It was a city of scholars, of poets, of the quiet, dignified business of living. It was the heart of a republic that was trying, with all the grace and clumsiness of a child learning to walk, to find its footing in the modern age. But the modern age, as the invaders demonstrated with a cold and systematic efficiency, does not always favor the scholar. It favors the man with the heavy artillery, the man who has decided that treaties are not shields for the innocent, but merely scrap paper to be ignited by the first match of conquest. When the legions approached the gates, the world watched with a polite, detached, and utterly useless concern. The diplomats in their far-off capitals clucked their tongues and fretted in the papers, expressing their deepest regret and their profound concern. It is a marvel, really, the amount of regret a diplomat can generate without ever leaving his comfortable chair. If regret were a commodity, those men would have been the wealthiest traders in the history of the globe. But their regret did not build a wall, and it did not deflect a single bayonet. It merely provided a thin, transparent veil behind which the powers of the world could hide their own cowardice. The fall of Nanking was not a battle in the sense that the Romantics would have us believe. It was not a struggle of iron against iron or a heroic stand of the brave against the wicked. It was an erasure. It was the deliberate, planned, and ruthlessly executed unraveling of a society. The invaders did not merely occupy the city, they sought to annihilate its memory. They looked upon the population, the shopkeepers, the mothers, the students, the children, and they decided that these were not human beings. They were obstacles. They were variables to be removed from the equation of a new imperial order. I have spent a good deal of my life observing the human animal, and I have come to the conclusion that we are at our most dangerous when we are being orderly. When a man is angry, he is at least acting like an animal, a wild, snarling, unthinking thing. But when a man is orderly, when he is bureaucratic, when he is following a procedure to extinguish the lives of thousands, he has surrendered the very thing that makes him human. The horror of Nanking lay not in the chaos, but in the efficiency. It lay in the checklists, the transportations, the systemic dismantling of a city block by block, house by house. It was a factory of death, operated by men who likely went home at the end of the day to write polite letters to their mothers. We are so fond of telling ourselves that we have evolved. We point to our steam engines, our radios, our skyscrapers, and we declare that we are the masters of the natural world. But nature, if left to its own devices, does not produce anything quite as depraved as Nanking. A lion does not keep a ledger of how many gazelles it has dispatched. A shark does not organize a parade to celebrate the efficiency of its hunting. Only man, with his grand intellect and his moral philosophy, has the capacity to turn destruction into a professional pursuit. The international community, which had spent the better part of the decade wringing its hands over the sanctity of sovereignty, found itself in a state of utter, paralyzed shock. They had signed the treaties, they had joined the League, they had promised that never again would they allow such things to happen. And yet, there they were, reading the telegrams from the observers on the ground, reading the accounts of the survivors, and responding with the same tired, recycled rhetoric that had failed to save a single soul. They were like a jury that spends so much time arguing over the rules of the court that the defendant has the time to burn the courthouse down. One has to wonder if the people who wrote those treaties actually believed they would work, or if they were merely writing them for their own amusement, like children playing house. There is a special kind of cynicism required to stand in a room filled with the ghosts of the past and promise that the future will be different, knowing full well that you have no intention of lifting a finger to ensure it. It is the cynicism of the man who sells you a life-preserver made of lead and assures you it will keep you afloat, because it is, after all, officially sanctioned. The fall of Nanking was the moment the mask of the 20th century slipped. It revealed the ugly, snarling reality beneath the paint. It showed that all our talk of international law and human rights was nothing more than a polite fiction we told ourselves so we could sleep soundly in our beds. It proved that if you are strong enough and if you are ruthless enough, you can write your own law in the blood of your enemies, and the rest of the world will merely look on, turn the page, and find something else to read. There is a grim, heavy silence that follows such events, a silence that is far more deafening than the roar of the guns. It is the silence of the world deciding that it is easier to look away. It is the silence of the complicit. In Nanking, that silence became a permanent part of the landscape. It hung over the Yangtze River like a shroud, and it settled into the bones of the city, a reminder that humanity, when it chooses to cast aside its conscience, is capable of sinking into a depth of depravity that no devil in hell could ever invent. We look back at 1937 and we see the fractures beginning to widen. We see the crumbling of the old order, and we see the rise of a new, sharper, and colder darkness. We see the nations of the world drifting toward the edge of an abyss, and we see them doing it with the same calm, unconcerned gait of a man strolling through a park. They think that because they have their umbrellas, they will be protected from the storm. They think that because they have their signatures on the paper, they are immune to the fire. But the fire of Nanking was not a local tragedy. It was a warning. It was a flare shot into the dark, illuminating the true nature of the storm that was gathering over the horizon. It told the world that the rules had changed, that the old world was dead, and that a new, pitiless era was upon us, an era where the only law that mattered was the law of the strongest, and where the only limit to our ambition was the depth of our own cruelty. And yet, despite it all, the city remained. The river continued to flow. The sun continued to rise over the hills, indifferent to the madness of the creatures below. It is the cruelty of the world that it does not stop, that it does not pause to mourn, that it does not demand an accounting. It just continues day after day, year after year, indifferent to the suffering we inflict upon one another. We are left, then, with the history books. We are left with the accounts, the letters, the photographs. Not that we want to look at them, of course. We would much rather look at the pretty pictures, the maps with the colored borders, the charts of our economic progress. We would much rather talk about the grand developments of our time than the unfortunate incidents of our morality. But the history of Nanking refuses to be buried. It waits for us. It stares at us from the pages, a silent accusation, a reminder that we have not achieved a state of civilization, but merely a state of refined barbarism. So, let us remember Nanking, not with the polite, hollow gestures of the diplomat, but with the cold, hard recognition of what we are capable of when we choose to walk away from our own humanity. Let us look at that bitter fall, not as an event that happened to someone else in a faraway place, but as an event that happened to all of us, as a species, as a civilization. Because until we learn that lesson, until we learn that the treaties are only as strong as the courage of the people who defend them, we are all just waiting for our own bitter fall, and the silence of the world will eventually come to claim us too. It is a grim, hard thought, but it is the truth, and if there is any hope for us at all, it lies in our ability to finally, after all these centuries, look the truth in the eye and stop pretending that we are anything other than what we are. Creatures of immense potential, capable of the most exquisite light and the most abysmal darkness, forever wandering the bridge between the two, hoping that we might finally find our way home. Chapter 15. The New Name on the Emerald Isle. There is in the nature of every nation a peculiar nagging itch that can only be scratched by the changing of a name. We are, as a species, remarkably susceptible to the notion that if we can just find the right set of syllables, if we can just baptize our patch of earth with a label that sounds sufficiently ancient, sufficiently noble, or sufficiently rebellious, we might suddenly transform into something entirely new. We treat our maps like the pages of a diary, constantly crossing out one entry and scribbling in another, hoping that the ghost of the past will be satisfied with the correction and leave us to our present. In the year of our Lord 1937, the Irish people, of folks who have spent a better part of their history fighting for the right to be ignored, and another better part fighting for the right to be noticed, decided that their current designation, the Irish Free State, was frankly a bit of a misnomer. It sounded, to the discerning ear, like a compromise. It sounded like the sort of name a lawyer would dream up when he wants to make sure that neither side is entirely happy and neither side is entirely wrong. It was a name that had been hammered out in the heat of a treaty, with the ink still wet and the nerves still frayed, and it had never quite sat right on the tongue of the citizenry. Free State, they seemed to say, peering at the words through their spectacles. It's a fine enough name for a bank, I suppose, or a livery stable, but for a nation with a history that stretches back to the time when the stars were younger, it lacks a certain gravity. And so, under the guidance of Mr. Ammon de Valera, a man who possessed the single-mindedness of a steam engine and the legalistic vocabulary of a Supreme Court justice, the nation set about the business of rewriting its own identity. They did not just want to change the sign on the front door. They wanted to take the house down to the foundation, dig up the floorboards, and rebuild the whole structure according to a blueprint that didn't have a single drop of British ink on it. The result was a constitution, a document as dense, as long, and as stubbornly deliberate as a winter in the Atlantic. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, written by a man who treated every comma as a battleground and every clause as a potential treaty. It was designed to do everything at once, to be a republic in all but name, to satisfy the dreamers and the pragmatists, and to politely but firmly hand the British crown its hat and show it the way to the exit. The most noticeable change, at least to the casual observer, was the name. They took the name Ireland, which had served the island well enough for a few millennia, and they decided to breathe new life into its old companion, air. It is a word that tastes of the morning mist and the damp earth of the bogs. It is a word that carries the weight of a language that had been pushed into the corners of the island by the relentless march of the English tongue. To call the nation air was to reclaim a heritage that had been treated like an embarrassing relative, hidden in the attic whenever the British came to call. But the real comedy, if one has the stomach for such things, was the way the Irish dealt with the King of England. For years, the British crown had been sitting in the Irish living room like a damp umbrella that no one quite knew how to ask to leave. It wasn't quite a guest, and it certainly wasn't a member of the family, but it was there, taking up space, demanding an occasional nod of deference, and reminding everyone that technically it had a right to the coat rack. The Irish, with that subtle, needle-sharp wit that characterizes the species, decided that the best way to deal with an unwanted house guest is to simply ignore his existence until he gets the hint and wanders off to find someone else to bother. The new Constitution didn't explicitly forbid the king, it just didn't seem to notice he was there. It was a masterful, passive-aggressive silence. They treated the British monarch with the polite, distant formality one accords to a distant cousin who has once been involved in a lawsuit against the family. He was, for all intents and purposes, a figurehead without a head, a symbol without a seat, a king of Ireland who reigned over absolutely nothing but the imagination of a few clerks in London. It is a grand, dizzying business, this cutting of the frayed ropes that bind a colony to the empire. We like to think of it as a clean break, like the snapping of a twig, but it is rarely so simple. It is more like the untying of 1,000 tiny, intricate knots. There are trade agreements, there are land titles, there are oaths of allegiance that are as sticky as molasses, and there are the generations of habits that are as hard to break as a bad reputation. The Irish spent the better part of the year carefully, meticulously, and with the patience of a spider, unraveling every single one of those knots. They were not merely declaring independence. They were conducting a legal exorcism. And the British? The British were, to put it mildly, profoundly baffled. They had spent centuries operating under the assumption that the world was their personal garden and that everyone else was merely a gardener. The idea that Ireland, the island that was, after all, just a stone's throw from the coast, would simply decide that it was no longer part of the arrangement was, to them, not just a political problem. It was a sort of cosmic affront. It was as if the lawn had suddenly decided it was a forest. They huffed, they puffed, and they blustered in the halls of Westminster, but there was very little they could do. What were they going to say? That Ireland wasn't allowed to call itself heir? That it had to keep a king it didn't want? One cannot easily force a nation to love a monarch, nor can one force a language to be forgotten, no matter how many schoolmasters you send to drum the Irish out of the children. The time for force had passed, and the time for diplomacy, that slow, agonizing, and often ridiculous process of talking until everyone is too tired to argue, had arrived. What struck me about the whole affair, watching from across the sea, was the sheer stubborn optimism of it all. To think that a few scraps of paper, a new name, and a bit of fancy language could settle the grievances of 800 years. It is a beautiful, if entirely misguided, hope. We are always trying to legislate away our history. We think that if we can just define ourselves clearly enough, if we can just draw a line in the sand and call it a border, we will finally be at peace with ourselves. But history, as I have observed, does not care about borders. It does not care about constitutions. It does not care about names. It flows through us like the tide, and it ignores the little sandcastles we build to keep it out. Air was a new name, yes, and the Constitution was a new suit of clothes, but the soul of the country remained what it had always been, a collection of people who were as quick to laugh as they were to fight, who were as devoted to their legends as they were to their grievances, and who would, in all likelihood, spend the next 100 years arguing over whether the new name was a grand success or a grand disappointment. It is a uniquely human paradox, is it not? We spend our entire lives trying to escape the influence of our predecessors, trying to define ourselves by what we are not, and in the process, we end up becoming the very things we were trying to run from. The Irish, in their attempt to define themselves as the anti-Briton, ended up adopting the very same parliamentary machinery, the same legalistic obsession, and the same bureaucratic delight in the minutiae of governance that they had inherited from their former masters. They had kicked out the king, but they kept the paperwork. And in a way, that is the most Irish thing of all. There is a lesson here, perhaps, for all the nations of the world who are busy tearing up their maps and writing new names on the blank spots. A name is just a name. It does not change the soil. It does not change the sky. And it certainly does not change the people who walk upon it. You can call yourself Air, or the Republic, or the Kingdom of the Seven-Headed Cat. But at the end of the day, you are still going to have to deal with the weather, the harvest, and your neighbors. And your neighbors, regardless of what you call them, will still be the same bunch of rascals they were yesterday. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the point is not that the name changes the reality, but that the name changes the feeling. There is a power in a name, a magic that whispers to the blood and stirs the spirit, to call your country by a name that is yours, a name that was yours before the empires came and will be yours long after they have crumbled into the dust. That is a comfort. It is a way of saying, we are here, we remember who we are, and we aren't going anywhere. And if, in the process, you have to write a constitution that is long enough to wrap around the moon, and if you have to play a game of legal hide-and-seek with a British king, well, that is a small price to pay for the feeling of being home. It is a ridiculous, grand, and entirely human enterprise. And I, for one, hope the Irish enjoy their new name. They have earned it, after all. They have spent enough time being called by someone else's labels, and they have surely earned the right to decide what they call themselves. Just don't expect the name to solve all your problems, my friends. For that, you would need a miracle. And miracles, as I have found, are in very short supply in the halls of government. But a name is a start. And in 1937, for a nation that had been waiting for a long time to speak for itself, a start was all that anyone could ask for. Chapter 16. The Great Purge reaches the General Staff. There is a particular brand of housekeeping that the absolute dictator favors, which bears a striking resemblance to the method a gardener might use if he were to decide that the best way to ensure the prize-winning roses didn't grow too tall was to uproot the entire garden and replace it with gravel. It is a tidy method, to be sure. It saves on fertilizer, it eliminates the inconvenience of pruning, and it ensures that nothing in the yard ever dares to cast a shadow on the gardener himself. In the year of our Lord 1937, Joseph Stalin, the man who held the Soviet Union in the palm of his hand with the gentle, crushing grip of a steel vise, decided that his general staff, the very men who had built the Red Army, the men who knew where the cannons were kept and how to move a division across a continent, were becoming entirely too tall for his liking. It is a queer business, the psychology of the tyrant. A man who lives in a palace surrounded by guards, secret police, and the sycophantic murmurs of men who would sell their own grandmothers for a slightly better office, eventually reaches a stage of mental development where he begins to look at his reflection in the mirror and suspect that the man staring back is plotting against him. Paranoia, you see, is the ultimate tax on the conscience of the wicked. Stalin, having spent years methodically dismantling the peasant class, the intellectuals, and the remnants of the old Revolutionary Guard, finally turned his gaze toward the army. He looked at the marshals, the veterans of the Civil War, the men with medals pinned to their chests like barnacles on a ship's hull, the men who had studied the art of war from the days of the cavalry charge to the age of the tank, and he saw not his protectors, but his rivals. He saw the potential for a coup, a quiet whisper in the barracks, a shift in the wind that might blow his own pedestal out from under him. And so he decided to perform a little bit of political housekeeping. He didn't bother with the messy business of military discipline. Why bother with courts-martial and evidence when you can simply have a man whisked away in the dead of night and replaced by someone who is significantly more enthusiastic about his own mortality? The Great Purge, which had been simmering like a pot of bad stew for months, suddenly boiled over, spilling its scalding contents directly into the laps of the military elite. One by one, the generals were called in for consultations. They went in with their chests full of ribbons and their heads full of strategy, and they came out as traitors. It was a spectacle that would have been hilarious if it were not so fundamentally terrifying. The accusations were a tapestry of imaginative drivel. They were spies for the Germans, spies for the Japanese, spies for the British, and spies for the ghosts of the Tsar. One could almost admire the sheer versatility of the imagination required to conjure such a list of offenses. It is the sort of logic that would make a mule weep with frustration. I imagine the conversations must have gone something like this. Comrade Marshal, you are accused of attempting to overthrow the state. But, comrade, I have spent the last 20 years training the infantry. Yes, and that is precisely why you are guilty. You are too good at training the infantry. If you can train them to fight for us, you can train them to fight against us. Therefore, you are a menace to the security of the proletariat. It is a logic of absolute circular perfection. If you are incompetent, you are a traitor. If you are competent, You are a dangerous traitor. If you are loyal, you are clearly hiding your treachery, which makes you a devious traitor. If you are dead, you are a posthumous traitor who had the audacity to stop breathing without the explicit permission of the Secretariat. It is a wonderful system, really. It saves a great deal of time on investigations. The effect on the Red Army was, to put it mildly, catastrophic. Imagine a football team suddenly deciding that the best way to win the championship is to fire the coach, the quarterback, the kicker, and the guy who knows how to inflate the balls all on the morning of the big game. And then, to cap it all off, replacing them with a group of enthusiastic teenagers who have never seen a football but who are excellent at chanting the team's slogans. That was the state of the Soviet military command. The men who knew how to manage logistics, how to organize artillery, how to read a map without getting lost. They were all sent to the cellars or the gulags, replaced by men whose primary qualification was that they were terrified enough to never disagree with the boss. The rest of the world looked on, scratching its collective head. The foreign observers, who had spent years worrying about the Red Menace and the vast surging power of the Soviet war machine, were suddenly struck by a realization. They didn't have to worry about the machine, because the fellow who owned it was busy taking it apart with a wrench. The French, the Germans, the British, they all watched with a mixture of horror and confusion, trying to calculate the strategic advantage of an enemy that was actively lobotomizing itself. It was the sort of behavior one expects from a suicide pact, not a superpower. Stalin, however, was delighted. He sat in his Kremlin office, looking at the files of the purged, and felt a deep, warm glow of security. He had done it. He had cleared the deck. There were no marshals left to challenge his brilliance, no strategists left to point out the folly of his ideas, no veterans left to remember the truth of the battles past. He was the sole arbiter of military genius, the supreme strategist, the man who knew everything about war except, perhaps, how to win one if the enemy decided to show up and put him to the test. It is a grand, dizzying business, this quest for absolute loyalty. We are told that the strength of a nation lies in its institutions, in its laws, in the wisdom of its leaders, and the skill of its defenders. But Stalin proved that a nation can also be built on the bedrock of fear. He proved that if you make the price of honesty high enough, you can create a country where everyone is lying to everyone else all the time, and doing it with such enthusiastic devotion that you might actually believe the country is thriving. He created a desert and called it peace. He created a vacuum and called it leadership. He destroyed the men who held the swords, and then he wondered why. When the wolves eventually came to the door, his new, terrified, inexperienced lieutenants didn't quite know how to hold the line. It is the sort of historical tragedy that one reads about with the same detached awe one feels when watching a house burn down. You know you should try to put it out, but the spectacle is so complete, so inevitable, and so remarkably, brutally efficient that you find yourself unable to look away. One must wonder what the men in the cellars thought of it all. As they waited for the end, did they look back on their lives, their service, their devotion to the party and the state, and wonder how they had failed to see the trap? Did they realize that the party they served was not a cause, but a cannibal? I suspect many of them did. I suspect they died with the bitter, hollow knowledge that they had been the architects of their own destruction, that they had spent their lives building a machine that was designed from the very first bolt to eventually consume them. The Great Purge was not just a purge of the military, it was a purge of the soul. It destroyed the memory of the revolution, it destroyed the pride of the army, and it left the Soviet Union as a hollow shell, held together by nothing but the iron-willed ego of one man. It made the nation safe for Stalin, but it made it utterly, hopelessly vulnerable to the world. It was a trade-off that only a man who loves his own power more than his own country could ever have made. So, the general staff was emptied, the files were burned, and the new men stepped into the offices that were still warm with the presence of their predecessors. They sat at the desks, they adjusted their uniforms, and they learned the first and only rule of survival in the new Soviet military. Never have an idea, never question the leader, and never, ever be better at your job than the man who is watching you from the palace. It is a formula for failure, to be sure, but it is also a formula for survival. And in 1937, for the men in the uniforms, survival was the only thing that mattered. The rest of the world waited. The generals of Europe, those mustache-twirling experts in the art of destruction, watched the chaos with growing interest. They were preparing for a war, and they were beginning to suspect that when that war came, they would be fighting an opponent who had spent the last year shooting his own best players before the kickoff. It was a dark, preposterous, and entirely human comedy. We spend our lives preparing for the inevitable. We build our defenses, we train our minds, we sharpen our swords, and then, at the critical moment, we trip over our own shoelaces and wonder why we fell. And Stalin? Stalin sat on his throne, very safe, very secure, and very, very lonely. He had the loyalty of every man in the room because there wasn't a man left in the room who dared to be anything else. He had achieved his goal. He had created the perfect army, an army that would never challenge him, never question him, and never, ever, under any circumstances, stop marching until he told them to, even if they were marching directly off the edge of a cliff. And the remarkable thing is, the army seemed perfectly happy to do it. After all, when the alternative is a bullet in the back of the neck, a walk off a cliff sounds positively, delightfully reasonable. That is the genius of the purge. It makes the most catastrophic decisions seem like a casual afternoon stroll. And that, I reckon, is the final biting joke of the year 1937. We are all marching, we are all loyal, and we are all, every last one of us, wondering where the cliff is, hoping against hope that we aren't the ones in the front row when the ground suddenly decides to disappear. Chapter 17. The heavyweight crown finds a new brow. There is a peculiar primal vanity in the way we humans have arranged our affairs, particularly when it comes to the business of declaring one man the best. In the animal kingdom, the matter is settled with a minimum of fuss. The biggest stag with the widest rack of antlers usually secures the affections of the ladies, and that is the end of the debate. But we, being more sophisticated and significantly more prone to long-windedness, prefer to settle our disputes through the medium of the prize ring. We take two fellows, oil them up, drape them in trunks that were designed by a tailor with a sense of humor, and encourage them to pummel one another until the referee, in his infinite wisdom, decides that one of them has had quite enough of the world's troubles for the evening. We call this the noble art, a label that strikes me as being remarkably optimistic, given that the primary objective is to rearrange the geography of your neighbor's face. In the year of our Lord 1937, the eyes of the world, or at least the eyes of that portion of the world that prefers to watch violence in a well-lit arena rather than a dark alley, were fixed upon the heavyweight championship. It was a contest that promised more than just a belt of leather and gold. It promised a glimpse into the changing tides of the age. On one side, you had James J. Braddock, a man they called the Cinderella Man. He was a fellow who had been scraped off the bottom of the Depression's barrel, a man who knew the ache of a hungry belly and the dignity of manual labor. He was the underdog's underdog, the fellow the crowd loves because he is, at his core, just like them, only with a tougher chin and a better left hook. Opposite him stood a youth from Alabama by the name of Joe Louis. He was a quiet, unassuming fellow, a man who carried his power not with the swagger of a braggart, but with the steady, ominous silence of a storm gathering on the horizon. They called him the Brown Bomber, a nickname that the newspapers employed with the casual, heavy-handed familiarity that characterized the press of the time. But in the ring, he was something else entirely. He was a force of nature, a man who moved with a grace that seemed at odds with his profession, a man whose fists traveled with the terrifying speed of an uncoiling spring. The arena was packed to the rafters, a sweltering, shouting mass of humanity that smelled of cheap cigars, nervous sweat, and the collective anticipation of a crowd that knows it is witnessing the turning of a page. You could feel the weight of it in the air, the social tension, the racial undercurrents, the frantic, desperate hope that for one night the world might make sense. We are always looking for a hero, you see. We are always looking for someone to stand in the light and tell us that, despite the soup lines and the bread lines and the general misery of the decade, there is still such a thing as greatness. Braddock fought with the heart of a lion, as he always did. He was a man who knew that his time had passed, that he was the ghost of a yesterday that was rapidly fading into the twilight. He took his lumps with a grim, workmanlike determination. He fought like a man who was used to getting up after being knocked down, a man who viewed the ring as just another extension of the docks, another place where you showed up, did the work, and hoped for the best. He was the last of the old guard, the symbol of a gritty, stubborn survivalism. But Joe Louis? Joe Louis was the future. He was the inevitability. There was no rage in his movements, no theatrics. He fought with a detached, clinical precision that was more terrifying than any amount of bluster. Every jab, every hook, every cross was delivered with the economy of a man who knows exactly how much force is required to solve the problem at hand. He was a man-made machine, honed in the gym and tempered by the pressures of a world that didn't want him to succeed. He was the quiet, rising tide that no wall could keep back. As the fight wore on, the contrast became as plain as the nose on a man's face. Braddock was slowing, his movements becoming heavy, his defenses beginning to fray at the edges. He was a brave man, a good man, but he was fighting a man who had transcended the sport. Louis wasn't just throwing punches, he was delivering a message. He was fighting for a generation that had been told over and over again that there was no place for them at the table. He was fighting for a dignity that no law could grant and no man could take away. When the end came, it was sudden. It was the sort of punch that you don't see coming until you are already waking up on the canvas, wondering where the stars went. It was a thunderclap, a clean, sharp, devastating blow that settled the matter once and for all. Braddock went down, and for a long moment the arena went absolutely, breathlessly silent. The king was dead, and the new king had arrived, and the world, that nervous, jittery, unsettled world, was left to contemplate what it all meant. The aftermath was a flurry of headlines and editorials. The papers, who had spent the better part of the fight trying to figure out which side to root for, suddenly declared that Joe Louis was the greatest thing since sliced bread, or at least since the invention of the automobile. They praised his poise, his manners, his quiet, devastating grace. They hailed him as a champion who would bring class back to the sport, as if the sport had ever been particularly worried about its pedigree. It was the usual tiresome business of the victors being written into the annals of sainthood while the losers are relegated to the footnotes. But beneath the surface of the acclaim, something deeper was shifting. For the millions of people who lived in the shadows of the American promise, Joe Louis was more than just a man who knew how to hit hard. He was a walking, breathing, fighting testament to the idea that talent, real, undeniable, unstoppable talent, could pierce through the thickest wall of prejudice. He was a symbol of the long, slow, and often agonizing progress toward a world where a man's worth was determined by his actions rather than his ancestors. It is a droll, if entirely human, inconsistency. We have built a society that loves the champion, that loves to crown the winner, that loves to parade the hero through the streets. And yet we have built that same society on a foundation of rules that are designed to keep the very people we celebrate in the shadows. We love the triumph, but we fear the change that the triumph represents. We want the excellence, but we aren't quite sure we want the equality. And Joe Louis, by simply being himself, by simply winning, forced us to look at that hypocrisy and squirm. I suspect that the heavyweight crown is a burden, not a prize. It is a crown that sits heavy on the brow, not because of its weight in gold, but because of its weight in expectation. Everyone wants a piece of you. Everyone wants you to represent their cause, to fight their battles, to be the icon that they need you to be. It is a lonely, exposed existence, standing in the center of that ring, knowing that a single misstep, a single loss, a single moment of vulnerability will be seized upon by the wolves who are waiting in the wings, eager to tear you down and return to the old, comfortable order. But Joe Louis, at least in those early days, wore the crown with a stoic, detached serenity. He remained the quiet Alabama youth, the man of few words and devastating results. He didn't play the part of the hero as the press wanted him to. He played the part of the professional. He did his job, he went home, and he let the rest of the world argue over what he meant. And perhaps that was the greatest triumph of all. To be a master of your craft in a world that wants to define you by your limitations, that is a kind of freedom that no amount of gold can buy. As for Braddock, the Cinderella man, he returned to the world from which he came, a man with a few more scars, a few more dollars, and the respect of his peers. He had lived the dream, he had stood in the light, and he had been beaten by a better man. That, too, is a kind of victory. There is no shame in being defeated by the inevitable. The shame is in never stepping into the ring at all, in never testing your mettle, in never daring to believe that you might, for one brief shining moment, be the best in the world. So the crown passed from one brow to another, and the world continued its slow, stumbling rotation, indifferent to the bruised ribs and the shattered egos of the men in the ring. The fight was over. The crowd went home, and the papers moved on to the next scandal, the next war, the next disaster. But for a few minutes on that summer night, the world had been held in the palm of a man from Alabama, and it had been forced to witness a kind of greatness that couldn't be explained away by the usual rules of the game. It was a small, fleeting, and entirely human moment of perfection. And in the grand ledger-filled book of the year 1937, it was perhaps the only page that actually told the truth about what we are capable of, if only we were given the chance to stand in the light. Chapter 18, The Celluloid Folly of the Seven Miners. There is no folly quite as grand, quite as audacious, and quite as likely to earn a man a one-way ticket to the poorhouse as the folly of an artist who decides that the rest of the world is too small-minded to understand his vision. Hollywood, that glorious, sun-drenched manufactory of illusions, has always been populated by a particular breed of creature known as the wiseacre. These are gentlemen who wear expensive suits, smoke cigars that cost more than a school teacher's monthly salary, and possess a singular, unerring ability to tell you exactly why your dreams are, statistically speaking, destined to result in bankruptcy. In the year of our Lord 1937, the wiseacres of the silver screen had fixed their collective gaze upon a fellow named Walt Disney. Mr. Disney, a man who possessed the stubbornness of a Missouri mule and the imagination of a feverish poet, had decided to undertake a project that was, by every metric known to the accountants of Tinseltown, a suicide mission. He was going to make a feature-length cartoon. Now, to the uninitiated, this might sound like a pleasant enough diversion, but to the moguls who ruled the roost, the idea was preposterous. A cartoon, they reasoned, was a diversion, a bit of fluff to be tucked away in the lobby of a theater while the main feature was being unspooled. It was meant to last for 6 minutes, provide a few giggles, and be forgotten before the popcorn had cooled. To ask an audience to sit in the dark for 80 minutes, watching nothing but lines on a piece of celluloid, was an insult to their attention spans. Disney's folly, they called it. The phrase was whispered in the plush offices of the studio heads. It was chuckled about over martinis at the country club, and it was written into the obituaries of Mr. Disney's career long before the first frame of the film had been painted. They were certain, with the absolute, unshakable confidence of men who have never dared to imagine anything they couldn't count in a ledger, that the public would recoil. Who would pay good money to watch a drawing of a poisoned princess, a jealous queen, and a collection of short-bearded chaps whose primary occupation was the extraction of minerals from the earth? It was, in their estimation, a recipe for the most spectacular flop in the history of the industry. But Mr. Disney, it seems, was not listening to the wiseacres. He was too busy presiding over a subterranean kingdom of his own making, where hundreds of young men and women spent their days in a state of celluloid slavery. They sat at drafting tables, hunched over stacks of paper like medieval monks illuminated by the glow of 1,000 electric candles, drawing the same dwarf's nose over and over again until the very concept of a nose began to lose all meaning. It was an act of madness, really. To take a fairy tale, a dusty, moth-eaten relic of the Brothers Grimm, and to bring it to life through the sheer brute force application of ink and paint. They worked with a fervor that would have baffled a steam engine mechanic. They broke down the movement of a shrug into 24 distinct drawings, They painted the color of a shadow onto 1,000 transparent sheets. They labored over the way a deer twitched its ear or the way a dwarf scratched his chin, until the lines themselves began to hum with the illusion of life. It was a factory of miracles, and the only thing being manufactured was a sense of wonder. The wiseacres watched the progress reports and shook their heads. They worried about the budget. They worried about the color. They worried that the whole thing would be too scary for the kiddies and too silly for the adults. They had an answer for everything except for the one thing that actually matters, the truth of the thing. They couldn't understand that a drawing, if it is done with enough conviction, is just as real as a flesh and blood actor and often significantly more charming. And then the day of the premiere arrived. The wiseacres arrived in their tuxedos, ready to see the crash. They were prepared to be polite, to offer their condolences, and to remind Mr. Disney that they had warned him all along. They sat in the darkened theater, their arms crossed, their minds already drafting the scathing reviews they would bestow upon the wreckage. But then the lights dimmed, the music swelled, a sweet, haunting melody that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly into the chest. The screen came alive. The colors, rich and vibrant as a stained glass window, flickered into the dark. And for a moment, just a fleeting, magical moment, the wiseacres forgot who they were. They forgot their ledgers. They forgot their skepticism. And they forgot that they were watching nothing more than a trick of light and shadow. I am told that something rather extraordinary happened that night. As the story unfolded, as the princess sang to her birds, as the dwarfs marched home from the mine, as the poison apple cast its shadow, the theater began to change. The cynical, worldly, hard-bitten men and women of the industry, the people who had made a business out of selling illusions, began to do the unthinkable. They began to weep. They cried not because they were sad and not because they were being manipulated, but because they had been touched by something that was genuinely, undeniably, and entirely beautiful. It was a total, unconditional surrender. The folly was a triumph. The wiseacres, when the lights finally came up, did not dare to look one another in the eye. They offered their applause with a sort of stunned, bewildered grace. They had come to bury Mr. Disney, and instead they had found themselves kneeling at the altar of his imagination. There is a lesson here, I suppose, if one has the wit to find it. It is that the human heart is a much more gullible, much more fragile, and much more wonderful thing than the wiseacres will ever understand. We are all of us, deep down, just children waiting for a good story. We want to be lied to, we want to be tricked, and we want to be taken on a journey that makes us forget the gray, grinding reality of our own lives for an hour or two. We don't care how the trick is done, whether it is a man on a stage, a book on a shelf, or 1,000 drawings of a dwarf. All we care about is the feeling. And if the feeling is true, then the illusion is real. Mr. Disney proved that you can build a cathedral out of nothing but paper and paint. He proved that if you have enough conviction, you can make the world believe in things that don't exist. It is a grand, dizzying power, and it is one that I have often envied. The writer, you see, has the same task. He sits before a blank page, trying to conjure a character out of ink, trying to weave a reality out of words, and hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, will read his scribbles and believe them to be true. He is a fraud, a trickster, a merchant of dreams, but he is a merchant who knows that his product is the most valuable thing on earth. As for the 7 miners, they became the most famous men in the world, despite the fact that they were made of nothing but celluloid and dreams. They taught the world that you could be small, you could be grumpy, you could be sleepy, and you could still be a hero. They taught us that even in a world governed by queens and kings and poisons, there is always a place for the fellow who simply shows up to do his work and keeps his heart in the right place. The wiseacres eventually went back to their offices. They returned to their ledgers and their martinis and their predictions of ruin. But they were never quite the same again. They had seen the folly succeed, and the memory of that success haunted them. They spent the rest of their days trying to replicate the miracle, trying to find the magic formula, trying to manufacture the wonder. But they never could, for the magic wasn't in the paint, and it wasn't in the paper. The magic was in the folly. It was in the audacity of the man who looked at the impossible and said, "I think I shall do that." And so we move on. We leave 1937 with its celluloid princess and its weeping moguls behind us. We carry the memory of that night, the night the wiseacres were proved wrong, as a reminder that the world is much bigger, much stranger, and much more prone to miracles than the accountants would have us believe. It is a funny thing, is it not, that the most real things we ever experience are the things that aren't real at all. But that is the way of the world. We live our lives in the shadows, waiting for the light to show us the truth. And sometimes, if we are very, very lucky, the light comes in the form of a cartoon, and we are, for one brief, perfect moment, home. I reckon I shall have to go and see the thing myself the next time the circus comes to town, though I suspect I shall be like the rest of them, hiding my handkerchief, pretending I've got a bit of dust in my eye, and hoping that no one notices that the great, cynical Mark Twain has been undone by a drawing of a dwarf with a squeaky voice. But then, there is no shame in that. There is no shame in being reminded that we are all at our core the sort of creatures who can be moved to tears by a bit of color and a bit of song. If the day ever comes when I am too wise, too old, or too cynical to be fooled by a fairy tale, then I shall know that the jig is up and I am truly, properly, and hopelessly dead. Until then, pass me the popcorn, and let us see what happens when the poison apple meets the princess. It is the greatest show on earth, and the ticket is worth every penny of the bargain. Chapter 19. The Passing of the World's First Billionaire. There is a peculiar fascination that we, the common sort, hold for the man who has managed to accumulate so much of the world's scratch that he requires a special highfalutin word just to describe his bank balance. In the year of our Lord 1937, humanity took a collective pause to observe the departure of the man who had effectively turned the word billionaire from a mathematical curiosity into a synonym for absolute untouchable power. Mr. John D. Rockefeller. He was, by all accounts, a man of precise habits, a digestion that required the meticulous chewing of every morsel, and a soul that seemed to have been carved out of the very oil-soaked earth he so successfully harvested. To think of Mr. Rockefeller is to think of the Standard Oil Company, an octopus of such reach and grip that it made the actual cephalopod seem like a timid, retiring sort of creature. He was the architect of the modern monopoly, the man who looked at the disorganized, brawling, messy business of selling kerosene and decided that the only sensible way to handle it was to own every single pipe, barrel, and drop of the stuff from the wellhead to the lampwick. There is a kind of genius in that, I suppose. It is the genius of the machine. It is the genius of the man who sees the world not as a collection of people, but as a collection of moving parts that can be lubricated, tightened, and set to work for his own benefit. Mr. Rockefeller understood, better than any man of his time, that wealth is not merely about money. It is about the control of the flow. He controlled the flow of oil, and in doing so, he controlled the flow of the century. He turned the dark, prehistoric sludge of the earth into the lifeblood of the industrial age, and he pocketed the difference. But 1937, you see, was a long time after the brawling days of the robber barons. By the time Mr. Rockefeller finally decided to shuffle off this mortal coil at the ripe, sturdy age of 97, the world had seen him undergo a transformation that would have made the local theater's magician tip his hat in respect. He had spent his final decades not as the grim, unyielding titan who crushed his competition like a boot on a beetle, but as the benevolent grandfather of the American landscape. He was the man who gave away shiny new dimes. It is a striking image, isn't it? The man who had extracted more wealth from the soil than any human being who had ever walked upon it, standing on a street corner, tossing a dime to a child like a king, bestowing a knighthood. It was a masterpiece of image management. It was the philanthropist act, the second half of the show, where the villain comes back out in a clean suit and tells the audience that the stabbing was all just a misunderstood metaphor. He built libraries, he built universities, he built medical foundations, all with the money that had been squeezed from the very people who were now lining up to thank him for his generosity. I have always admired the brass of it. It takes a certain magnificent gall to build an empire by breaking the back of the competition, and then to use the proceeds to build a school of divinity. It is the sort of grand, sweeping irony that would make a novelist throw up his hands in despair, declaring it too thick to be believed. And yet, the public bought it. They loved the dimes, they loved the libraries, they loved the idea that a man could be so rapacious, so cold, and so utterly ruthless in the accumulation of his fortune, and then, by the grace of a well-placed checkbook, scrub himself clean of the soot of the marketplace. Mr. Rockefeller lived for 97 years, a span of time that is, quite frankly, absurd. He lived to see the horse replaced by the carriage replaced by the motor car, and the motor car replaced by the traffic jam. He lived to see the world grow smaller, louder, and infinitely more complicated, while he sat in his quiet, air-conditioned rooms, counting his interest and perfecting the art of the long life. He was a survivor of the highest order. He had seen off his rivals, he had seen off the muckrakers, and he had seen off the government's attempts to break his empire apart. He had outlived them all simply by being efficient, being patient, and being completely, entirely unconcerned with whether or not the neighbors liked him. And then the end came. The ticker tape stopped, the interest ceased to accrue, and the man who had bought the world found that he could not, in the end, purchase an extension on the lease. He departed for the great unknown, leaving behind a fortune that was, in its sheer mind-boggling scale, impossible for any normal man to conceive. One wonders what goes through the mind of a billionaire as the curtain draws closed. Does he think of the oil? Does he think of the dimes? Does he think of the libraries? Or does he think of the rivals he left in the dust? I suspect, if the truth be told, that he thinks of none of those things. I suspect that at the very end, when the ledgers are put away and the house is quiet, the man is exactly the same as the pauper. He is a creature of flesh and bone, and he is a creature who is about to learn with sudden and absolute certainty that all the money in the world cannot buy a single extra second of time. It is the great leveling irony of the human condition. We spend our lives building towers, hoarding gold, and striving to leave a mark that can be seen from the moon, forgetting that the wind and the rain and the slow, inexorable turning of the earth do not care a fig for our bank balances. The grave does not discriminate. It does not ask to see your portfolio. It does not check your references. And it certainly does not care how many libraries you built in your name. It simply opens, it takes its due, and it closes. And then the world goes on. The prices of stocks continue to fluctuate, the oil continues to flow, and the people continue to worry about their rent, entirely indifferent to the fact that the man who once owned the whole works has gone to wherever it is that the masters of the universe go when the money runs out. His legacy, of course, is a complicated business. There are those who will remember him as the man who brought order to the chaos of the petroleum industry, the man who powered the cities and lit the night. And there are those who will remember him as the man who set the pattern for the modern corporation, the man who taught us that if you want to win the game, you must ensure that no one else is allowed to play it. He was a builder, and he was a destroyer, and he was both with the same mechanical efficiency. I suppose the most whimsical thing about the passing of John D. Rockefeller is the timing of it. He left the stage just as the world was beginning to turn itself inside out, just as the clouds of war were beginning to darken the horizon, and just as the industrial machine he had helped to build was about to be put to the most terrible, destructive use imaginable. He was spared the sight of the final, bloody chapters of the decade he helped to shape. He was allowed to depart in a time of relative, if anxious, prosperity, leaving his fortune to be managed by the foundations and the trusts that would carry on his name long after the oil wells had run dry and the libraries had gone to seed. He was the world's first billionaire, a title that has a sort of ring to it, like the name of a character in a Jules Verne novel. But being a billionaire is, in the final analysis, a very lonely business. You are isolated by your own excess. You are surrounded by people who want something from you, people who fear you, and people who envy you. And it becomes, I imagine, quite impossible to know who you are underneath the pile of gold. I often think of Mr. Rockefeller in his later years, walking through his gardens, chewing his crackers, and tossing those dimes to the children. I wonder if he ever looked at those children and saw not the future of the nation, but the competition he had outlasted. I wonder if he ever felt a twinge of guilt, or if he was simply and profoundly satisfied with the game he had played. He was a man who lived by the rules of the ledger, and he died having balanced the books to his own satisfaction. And so we shall leave him to his rest. The world will go on, as it always does, fueled by the oil, governed by the monopolies, and haunted by the ghosts of the great men who thought they were masters of the universe. We shall keep our own ledgers, we shall keep our own scores, and we shall keep chasing our own fortunes, hoping that when our time comes, we have left something behind that is worth more than a stack of nickels and a pile of debts. It is a grand, absurd, and entirely necessary drama. The life of the billionaire, it is a story of ambition, of success, and of the inevitable crushing weight of mortality. And it is a story that reminds us, if we have the sense to listen, that we are all just guests in this world, and that the only thing we get to keep when we leave is the memory of the things we didn't buy and the people we didn't cheat. Mr. Rockefeller was a man who owned the world, but he couldn't keep a single square inch of it. And that, I reckon, is the most profound lesson the first billionaire ever gave us. We are all of us just passing through, and the best we can hope for is that when the bill finally comes due, we have enough change in our pockets to pay for the tip. Chapter 20, The Balance Sheet. And so, the ledger closes. It is a peculiar habit we have, we humans, of breaking the world down into neat, orderly circles of 12 months, as if the universe cares a fig for our calendars or the way we count our days. We sit at our desks, clutching our pens, and we attempt to balance the books of the past year column by column, entry by entry, hoping that if we add the disasters to the triumphs and subtract the follies from the inventions, we might find that the total at the bottom of the page is written in black ink. But the ledger of humanity is a messy, splattered, and utterly irreconcilable document. It is a record kept by a clerk who is perpetually drunk, and who has a regrettable tendency to write in the margins with a quill dipped in blood. The year 1937 was, by any reasonable estimation, a year of breathtaking, frantic activity. We built bridges that defied the gravity of the sea. We sailed the air in leviathans that kissed the clouds. We wove thread from the very air and the coal of the earth. We debated the makeup of our courts, and we watched, with a sort of horrified fascination, as the world began to tip, ever so slightly, toward the edge of a precipice. If one were to look at the assets column, if one were to tally up the brilliant, shimmering, and undoubtedly clever things we accomplished, it would make a fine, handsome list. We proved, for instance, that a man could sit in a factory and change the nature of labor. We proved that we could box up the world's greatest fighter and watch him dismantle the past with a single, precise hook. We proved that a man could design a rolling basket and change the way an entire nation eats, shops, and consumes. We proved that we had conquered the air, and if we also proved that we had failed to master the fire that kept us aloft, well, that is just the price of doing business with the heavens. But then one must flip the page and look at the liabilities. And here the ink is thick and dark and difficult to read. We have the charred remains of the Hindenburg, a monument to our refusal to respect the volatile temper of the elements. We have the smoking ruins of Guernica, a lesson in how the sky can be turned into a weapon of the most industrial, soul-crushing variety. We have the empty chairs in the Soviet General Staff, a testament to the fact that a leader who is afraid of his own shadow is a leader who will eventually burn his own house down. We have the blood on the grass in Chicago, a stain that reminds us that our New Deal is often just a fancy coat of paint on an old rickety structure. The balance sheet is, to put it mildly, a disaster. We have spent millions of dollars, millions of hours of labor, and the cumulative, exhausting effort of 100 million minds, and yet, what is the net result? We have built a world that is technologically miraculous and morally bankrupt. We have the tools of gods and the wisdom of toddlers. We have the power to connect the globe with a radio signal, yet we use it to broadcast the ravings of madmen. We have the knowledge to feed the hungry, yet we are busy sharpening our swords to ensure they go without. It is a grand, dizzying, and profoundly depressing paradox. We are a species that can solve the riddle of the synthetic fiber, but we cannot solve the riddle of why we feel the need to destroy our neighbor's fence. We can split the atom in our dreams, but we cannot share the bread on the table. Our technological brilliance is nearly infinite, expanding outward like the reach of the stars, while our political wisdom remains small enough to fit inside a thimble and twice as dusty. Perhaps that is the nature of the beast. We are at our core restless, dissatisfied, and deeply, uncontrollably curious. We must explore, we must build, we must invent, and we must tinker. We are like children in a workshop filled with sharp tools, and we are simply incapable of keeping our hands off the machinery. We want to see how it works. We want to see what happens when we pull the lever, and we want to see if we can make it go faster, higher, and louder. And if in the process we occasionally smash our thumbs or set the curtains on fire, well, we tell ourselves that it is all part of the education. But the year 1937 suggested something else. It suggested that our education is lagging behind our experimentation. We are operating the machine at full speed, but the brakes are made of tissue paper, and the steering wheel is held on by a prayer. We are accelerating into the future, and we haven't the faintest idea where the road is going or if the bridge ahead has been washed out by the tide of our own history. Consider the grocery cart. It is a simple thing, really, a chair, a basket, and some wheels. And yet, it encapsulates our entire philosophy. We want it easy. We want it fast. We want to be able to carry more than we need, and we want to be able to do it without having to exert ourselves. We are a civilization of the cart. We are constantly looking for the contraption that will make the burden of living feel just a little bit lighter, never stopping to consider that the cart is merely a way of piling on more weight. We fill our carts with the excess of the modern age, and then we wonder why we are so tired, why the pace is so frantic, and why we can never seem to find a moment of peace. And consider the warplanes. They, too, are a product of the same spirit. They are the ultimate expression of our desire to transcend the limitations of the earth. We don't want to walk. We want to fly. We don't want to fight in the trenches. We want to strike from the heavens. We want to be above the fray, untroubled by the dirt and the mud and the screaming of the dying. We want to be the masters of the horizon, and in our quest to be the masters, we have forgotten that the higher we climb, the further we have to fall. The balance sheet of 1937 is not just a record of our accomplishments, it is a confession of our character. It shows that we are capable of the most exquisite, breathtaking feats of creation, and yet we are haunted by a destructive impulse that seems to be hardwired into our very marrow. We are a species that is perpetually engaged in a civil war with itself, a tug of war between the angel and the monkey, and the rope is fraying. I have often wondered if it would be better if we were a bit less clever. If we didn't have the radio, would we be happier? If we didn't have the airplane, would we be kinder? If we didn't have the synthetic thread, would we be less obsessed with the vanity of our own appearance? It is a seductive thought, the idea of the simple life, the life of the farmer and the craftsman, the life where the sun dictates the hours and the season dictates the work. But that, I fear, is a fantasy. We are not simple creatures. We are cursed with the need to know, the need to build, and the need to change. We are the architects of our own predicament, and there is no going back. We have tasted the fire, and now we must learn to live with the smoke. So, where does that leave us? As we stand on the threshold of the next year, clutching our pens and peering into the dark, what is the final entry in the ledger? I suspect that the final entry is blank. It is a space waiting for us to fill it. It is a reminder that the balance sheet is not a historical document. It is a live, breathing, and terrifyingly active account. Every day, every hour, every moment, we are adding to the columns. We are deciding, by the choices we make, whether the total will be written in black or in red. We are a species that has been given a great deal of responsibility, and we have proven ourselves time and again to be remarkably ill-equipped to handle it. We are the custodians of a world that is far older, far wiser, and far more patient than we are. We are the tenants who have decided in our arrogance that we are the owners. And if we don't learn to respect the property, if we don't learn to temper our ambition with a bit of humility, the landlord is eventually going to come knocking, and he is not going to be interested in our excuses. But for now, the year 1937 is done. It has been a year of steel and smoke, of bridges and bombs, of heroes and tyrants. It has been a year that has shown us the very best and the very worst of what we are capable of. And as I sit here looking at the pages I have filled, I am struck by a sense of weary, stubborn, and entirely irrational hope. We are a difficult, troublesome, and prone to stumbling species, yes. We have a way of tripping over our own feet and blaming the scenery. But we also have a way of getting back up. We have a way of dusting off our coats, straightening our hats, and marching into the next year with a grim, defiant determination to do better. Maybe that is the secret. Maybe the ledger isn't meant to be balanced. Maybe the point isn't to reach the end of the year and find that we have achieved a state of perfection. Maybe the point is just to keep writing, to keep adding our entries, and to keep believing against all the evidence to the contrary that the next page will be the one where we finally get it right. It is a beautiful, if entirely misguided faith. It is the faith of the gambler who knows the house always wins, but who plays anyway because he loves the sound of the cards being shuffled. And if you ask me, I wouldn't have it any other way. I'd rather be a fool who hopes for the best than a wise man who prepares for the worst. I'd rather be the man who builds the bridge, even if I know that one day it might fall. I'd rather be the man who writes the story, even if I know that the ending is a mystery I will never truly understand. So, let the books be closed on 1937. Let the past stay in the past, where it belongs, preserved in the amber of our memories. We have a new year coming, a new ledger to fill, and a new set of chances to make a mess of things, or perchance to get it right. And as for me, I shall be waiting with my pen, ready to see what kind of comedy, tragedy, or farce we manage to conjure up next. After all, the show must go on. The curtain is up, the actors are in their places, and the audience is waiting. And if I know us, we shall provide a performance that will leave them, if nothing else, thoroughly, utterly, and entirely bewildered. That is the human way, and I wouldn't trade it for all the gold in the treasury of the world. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I hear the next year knocking at the door, and I'd best see what kind of trouble it's brought along with it. I have a feeling it's going to be a doozy.